Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The headlights carved through Utah darkness like a scalpel through black flesh. I'd been driving for 3 hours along the secondary roads, chasing the promise of untouched rock formations under starlight. My camera bag rattled softly in the passenger seat with each pothole, a familiar rhythm that usually calmed me. Tonight, it sounded like teeth chattering. Route 6 stretched ahead, abandoned and perfect. The old mile marker stood crooked against the sky, its reflective surface dulled by decades of desert wind. This was the spot I'd marked on my map weeks ago, far enough from light pollution, close enough to those sandstone spires that looked like frozen screams in my telephoto lens. I pulled over, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was the held breath of the desert, waiting. Setting up for night photography requires patience and precision. I'd done this hundreds of times. Tripod first, camera mounted, cable release attached. The cold metal of my aluminum tripod bit into my palms as I extended its legs, positioning it 20 feet from the car. The Milky Way sprawled above, a river of light I'd capture in 30-second exposures. That's when I heard it, a deliberate crunch of gravel behind me. I turned, headlamp beams sweeping the darkness. Nothing, just sagebrush trembling in the windless night. I returned to my viewfinder, adjusting the focus on a distant rock formation that looked like a hand reaching from the earth. Another crunch, then another. Measured, precise, like someone maintaining a specific distance, close enough to watch, far enough to deny. My finger hovered over the shutter release. The sound stopped. I counted 10 breaths, then 20. The desert held its silence again, but now it felt expectant, watching. I took 3 shots, the camera's mirror slap unnaturally loud. Each time, those footsteps answered from the darkness, matching my movements. When I stepped left to reframe, gravel shifted left. When I knelt to adjust the tripod, a pause, then the distinct sound of weight settling lower to the ground. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Coyotes, wind-blown debris, the acoustic tricks desert spaces play. But coyotes don't match your movements with deliberate precision. Wind doesn't pause when you pause. I forced myself through 5 more shots, each shutter click feeling like provocation. The presence, because that's what it had become in my mind, a presence, maintained its careful distance. Never closer, never farther. Like it was tethered to me by an invisible rope exactly 15 feet long. The decision to leave came suddenly, instinctively. I grabbed my camera, leaving the tripod for a quick second trip, and walked briskly to the car. The footsteps followed, no longer trying to hide their synchronization with mine. I threw the camera bag in the passenger seat and spun back for the tripod. It was gone. The patch of gravel where I'd positioned it showed the circular impressions of its feet, but the tripod itself had vanished. My headlamp beam searched frantically, illuminating nothing but empty desert, and that watching darkness beyond its reach. Then I heard the trunk close. My trunk. I ran to the back of the car, fingers fumbling with the key fob. The trunk light illuminated my tripod, collapsed and placed neatly inside. Moisture beaded on its legs, dew that wouldn't form for hours yet, as if it had been somewhere else, someone else, and returned. I slammed the trunk and got in the car, locking the doors with shaking fingers. The engine turned over on the 3rd try. As I reached for the GPS, its screen flickered to life without my touch. A route appeared, not one I'd programmed, but showing as recent destination. A shortcut through the desert to something called Painted Valley Overlook. I knew that name. Every local photographer did. The overlook had been closed since 1987 after a series of accidents. The access road was supposedly chained off, the viewing platform dismantled. But here it was on my GPS, 17 miles away, the route already calculated. The rational thing would have been to drive home, delete the route, Forget the whole night. But something else had taken hold. Not curiosity exactly, more like the gravitational pull of predetermined events. My hands turned the wheel before my mind decided to follow the route. The GPS led me deeper into the desert, onto roads that shouldn't have existed. The pavement gave way to packed dirt, then to barely visible tire tracks. My headlights caught glimpses of things that didn't belong. A mailbox with no house, a stop sign in the middle of nowhere, power lines that led to nothing. After 12 miles, the chains appeared in my headlights. Heavy links stretched across the road, a Forest Service sign warning of danger, unstable ground, federal penalties for trespassing. But in the dirt beyond the chains, fresh tire tracks curved into the darkness. Deep treads, recent, maybe hours old. I stopped the car and got out, leaving the engine running. The tire tracks were singular, one vehicle traveling alone. But as I followed them with my flashlight beam, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every 50 feet or so, the track stopped. Not turned around, not pulled over, just stopped, as if the vehicle had simply ceased to exist, then reappeared 50 feet ahead. The chains were real enough, cold and solid under my hands. But as I touched them, testing their weight, I heard it again, the measured crunch of gravel. This time from ahead, beyond the chains, where those impossible tire tracks led. I looked through my camera's viewfinder, using the telephoto lens as a telescope. In the green ghost light of the LCD screen, I saw the overlook platform. It was intact, not demolished as records claimed, and there was something else. A figure standing at the railing, back turned, looking out over the valley. The figure raised something to its face. Through my lens, I saw it was a camera, the exact make and model as mine. As I watched, it turned slightly, just enough for me to see the strap. My strap, the custom one with my initials embroidered in blue thread. I lowered my camera and looked down. My strap was gone, the camera hanging from my neck by nothing but habit and denial. The figure at the overlook turned fully now, facing me across the half-mile of desert. Even at that distance, even in darkness, I could see it was smiling. It raised the camera, my camera, and I heard the distinctive sound of my shutter, impossible across such distance but clear as if it were right beside me. Then the viewfinder in my hands went dark. The camera was dead, battery drained. But on the LCD screen, frozen in the last moment before it died, was a photo I hadn't taken, a photo of me, standing at the chains, taken from the overlook. In the image, I wasn't alone. The darkness behind me wasn't empty. It was full of shapes, human-like but wrong, all of them holding cameras, all of them photographing me, photographing them. I ran back to the car, threw it in reverse, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. The GPS tried 3 times to recalculate, to turn me back toward the overlook, before I ripped it from the dashboard and threw it out the window. It was only when I reached the main highway, when the familiar sight of actual traffic lights and legitimate road signs restored some sense of reality, that I realized my tripod was set up in the passenger seat, extended, positioned as if composing a shot. The camera that had been dead was mounted on it, powered on, a new photo on the screen. The image showed the interior of my car, taken from the passenger seat while I was driving. In the driver's seat was someone who looked exactly like me, except for the eyes. They were closed. In the photo, I was driving with my eyes closed and smiling, and my hands weren't on the wheel. I pulled over at a gas station, fluorescent lights harsh and wonderfully real. I left the car running and walked inside, needing the mundane normalcy of tired cashiers and overpriced coffee. When I returned, the tripod had been collapsed and returned to the trunk, wet with dew. The camera was back in its bag, lens cap on, battery dead again. The GPS, the one I'd thrown out the window miles back, was reinstalled on the dashboard. A new route was programmed, home, the exact route I would have taken. Every turn, every lane change I preferred. But the arrival time was wrong. It showed I'd arrived 3 hours ago. I drove home in silence, following the route because any deviation felt wrong, felt watched. The clock on the dashboard matched the GPS's impossible timeline. I was driving through time that had already happened, covering ground I'd somehow already traveled. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the eastern sky was starting to pale. I grabbed my gear and headed inside, not looking back, not checking the photos. But as I closed the front door, I heard it one last time. Gravel crunching in my driveway, measured and deliberate. I looked through the peephole. My car was gone. In its place, tire tracks that stopped and started, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. The next morning, or was it the same morning? My car was in the driveway where it should be. The camera bag was on my desk, everything normal except for one thing. The memory card was full. Thousands of photos I didn't remember taking. They were all of me, standing at various points along Route 6, setting up shots, driving, sleeping in my own bed, images from angles that didn't make sense, from times I knew I was alone. In every photo, I was smiling that same smile, eyes closed, hands positioned as if holding something that wasn't there. The last photo was different. It showed the overlook, bright in daylight that hadn't yet come. A figure stood at the railing, face unclear but familiar in its stance, its posture, the way it held the camera. The metadata showed it was taken tomorrow, at coordinates that didn't exist, with a camera serial number 1 digit different from mine. I still have the photos. I've stopped looking at them, but sometimes I hear the sound of shutters clicking from the room where I keep the camera. Sometimes I find new images on the card, places I'll visit next week, next month, wearing clothes I haven't bought yet. The GPS still suggests that route sometimes. The shortcut to Painted Valley Overlook. The arrival time is always wrong, always impossible. Sometimes it shows I've already been there. Sometimes it shows I'm there right now, even as I sit at home, typing this, trying to make sense of that night. But here's what haunts me most. Last week I found a receipt in my camera bag. It was from a camera shop in a town I've never visited, for a tripod I don't remember buying. The date on the receipt is next month. The signature is mine, but written in a hand that trembles like I'm old, like I've been taking these photos for decades still to come. I've stopped photographing at night, but sometimes when I check my gear, the tripod is wet with dew that hasn't fallen yet. And I know that somewhere out there, on a Route 6 that exists between seconds, someone who is and isn't me is still shooting, still following, still maintaining that careful, deliberate distance. The camera's battery is dead, has been dead for months, but sometimes I hear it, the mirror slap, the shutters whisper, capturing moments that haven't happened yet in places that never were, with equipment that belongs to no one and everyone who's ever stopped at that crooked mile marker, looking for the perfect shot. I checked the memory card one last time before writing this. There's a new photo. It shows someone reading these words on a screen, brow furrowed, leaning closer to make sense of something that refuses to be sensible. The timestamp is now. The photographer is standing right behind them, maintaining that perfect, careful distance. Still watching, still shooting, still using equipment that knows its job better than any of us know ourselves. Story 2. The first call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that smelled like wet drywall and forgotten antiseptic. I'd been mapping the electrical systems in the east wing of St. Bartholomew's for 2 weeks, and the silence had become my companion. That particular silence of abandoned hospitals where even your breathing sounds like an intrusion. The building had been shuttered for 8 years before the developers bought it, promising to transform decay into luxury lofts for Detroit's returning young professionals. Until then, it was just me, my clipboard, and 12 floors of peeling paint and broken dreams. The phone shouldn't have rung. The entire floor had been without power for 3 days while we replaced the main junction boxes. But there it was, that distinctive double ring of an internal line, echoing from what used to be the nursing station. The sound made my teeth ache, like fingernails dragging across my skull from the inside. I stood there, fluorescent work light casting my shadow in 3 different directions, listening to it ring, 4 times, 5, 6. Then silence again, thick as the dust motes dancing in my flashlight beam. The rational part of my brain, the part that understood circuits and voltage and ground faults, told me it was impossible. Old buildings played tricks. Pipes knocked, metal contracted, but phones without power didn't ring. I walked to the nursing station, my steel-toed boots crushing plaster chunks into powder. The phone sat there, a beige relic from the early 90s, its cord severed and coiled like a dead snake. The display panel above it showed extension 4401, a number that, according to my blueprints, belonged to a room that had been demolished 6 months ago. My phone was recording before I consciously decided to pull it out. The video would show nothing but darkness and debris, but the audio, I needed proof I wasn't losing it in this maze of medical-grade loneliness. The ringing started again, this time from down the hall. Extension 4415, then 4423. A cascade of phantom calls, each one slightly off rhythm, like a heartbeat struggling to find its pace. I followed them, recording everything, my breath forming small clouds in the October cold that had claimed the building. In room 4423, I found the phone mid-ring. This one still had power somehow. The caller ID display glowed a sick green in the darkness. The number showing was 4401. The demolished room was calling. I answered it. The static that greeted me felt alive, writhing through the earpiece like something trying to claw its way into my ear canal. Then, cutting through the white noise, "Ready." The voice was flat, professional, like someone confirming an order. I held the phone away from my face, staring at it as if it might explain itself. The static continued for another second, then, "You can come up." I hung up. My hand was shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from that peculiar vertigo you get when reality shifts slightly to the left and you're not sure if you shifted with it. Back at the nursing station, I played the recording on my phone. The ringing was there, clear as broken glass. But when the parts where I'd heard the voices should have played, my phone produced only my own breathing, heavy and ragged. I played it again, then again. Each time, the gap where the voice should be seemed to grow longer, as if the recording was eating itself. But I could still hear them. Even without the phone, without the recording, those words circled my brain like water going down a drain. "Ready? You can come up." The next 3 days passed in a blur of routine work and persistent wrongness. Phones rang on every floor I visited, always from extensions that shouldn't exist. I stopped recording after the 10th call. They never played back anyway. Instead, I started writing down what I heard, filling a notebook with cryptic fragments. "Locked. Third door. He's here. Not yet, not yet, not yet." My supervisor never heard them. Neither did the 2 electricians working on the 7th floor. I'd stand there, phone shrieking 6 feet away, and watch them work through it like it wasn't happening. Once, I asked if they heard anything strange. They looked at me like I'd asked if they could see the color of Thursday. It was on Friday that I found the key cabinet, hidden behind a false panel in what used to be the administrator's office. It was a monument to institutional organization. Hundreds of keys on hundreds of hooks, each labeled with typewritten tags yellowed by years and neglect. Most were exactly what you'd expect. Supply room C, maintenance shaft 2, roof access north. But in the 3rd row, 7 keys hung beneath tags written in blue ballpoint pen. The handwriting was mine. I recognized the way I crossed my 7s, the particular slant of my lowercase a. Each tag bore my name followed by a room number. Robinson, 7734 Robinson, 7735, Robinson, 7736. My mouth went dry. I'd never worked at St. Bartholomew's before this renovation. I'd never been inside the building until 3 weeks ago. But the handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the small scar on the R where I'd pressed too hard and torn through the paper. I took key 7734. The 7th floor was scheduled for demolition next month, but it was still intact. A snapshot of institutional medical care circa 1987. According to my floor plans, the 7,700 corridor had been sealed off after a fire in 2008. The rooms there were marked as structural damage, no entry. but the key turned smoothly in a lock that shouldn't have been oiled in over a decade. The room beyond defied the building's timeline. It was clean, not sterile clean like a functioning hospital, but maintained clean, like someone had been dusting every week for years. The bed was made with military precision, corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. The walls held frames with nothing inside them, just clean glass over white backing. And in the dust on the floor, because there's always dust, even in the cleanest abandoned places, footprints. Fresh ones. Size 13 at least, maybe 14. My feet swam in size 10s. The phone on the bedside table rang. This time I didn't hesitate. I picked it up, pressed it to my ear, and waited. "You're early." The voice was clearer now, masculine but hollow, like someone speaking from the bottom of an empty swimming pool. I wanted to ask early for what, but my throat had constricted to the width of a coffee stirrer. Instead, I managed a sound somewhere between acknowledgement and panic. "Room 7735, 20 minutes. The line went dead. Not the click of hanging up, but the absolute silence of a connection that never existed. I stood in that impossible room, holding that impossible phone, and felt my understanding of the world develop hairline fractures. The rational explanation, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that the isolation and the creeping dampness of this place had gotten to me, felt less real than the alternative. Because crazy people don't usually know they're crazy, do they? They don't stand there cataloging their delusions, checking them against reality like items on an inventory list. The footprints in the dust led to the window. I followed them, careful not to disturb the impressions. The glass was clean here too, offering a view of Detroit's skyline that should have been blocked by the new construction next door. But there was no construction. There was no next door. Just the city as it might have been in 1995, complete with the old Hudson's building standing proud against the sunset. I backed away from the window, my hip hitting the bed frame. The impact was real, solid, painful. This was happening. Whatever this was, it was happening. 20 minutes. Room 7735. I could leave. I could walk out of the building, get in my truck, drive home to my apartment in Ferndale, and pretend none of this ever happened. Let someone else finish the electrical survey. Let someone else find the keys with their name already written. But I knew I wouldn't. Because the thing about impossible situations is that they demand resolution. They're like a splinter in your mind, working deeper with every thought until you have to dig it out or go septic with wondering. I used my phone's timer. 20 minutes exactly. Room 7735 was different. Where 7734 had been frozen in selective preservation, this room writhed with slow decay. The walls sweated something that wasn't quite water, and the floor had developed a sponginess that made walking feel like traversing a giant tongue. The smell hit me like a physical presence. Not rot exactly, but the anticipation of rot. The moment just before fresh becomes foul. The footprints were here too, but they weren't in dust. They were pressed into the floor itself, as if the linoleum had been soft when they were made. They led to a chair in the center of the room, facing away from the door. Someone was sitting in it. I couldn't see them. The chair's high back blocked my view, but I could see their shadow on the wall, thrown by emergency lighting that shouldn't have been working. The shadow was wrong. Too tall. Too angular. Moving slightly even though the figure in the chair was perfectly still. The phone rang. This one was on a medical cart beside the chair, the old kind with wheels that shrieked when you moved them. I walked around the chair's edge, keeping my distance, trying to see who was sitting there while reaching for the phone. The chair was empty, but the shadow remained on the wall, independent and impossible, head turned as if watching me. I answered the phone with a hand that no longer felt entirely my own. "You see it?" Not a question. I made another non-sound of agreement. "Good. Room 7736. Now." This time I ran. Not away, toward. Because running away would mean acknowledging that this was something to run from, and I wasn't ready for that level of admission. I was a maintenance tech. I fixed things. I understood things. And I would understand this. Room 7736 didn't exist on my floor plan. Where it should have been, the blueprint showed a solid wall. But the key turned, and the door opened, and beyond it was not a room, but a corridor that stretched far longer than the building's footprint allowed. The walls here were covered in phones. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all different makes and models from the last 50 years. They rang in sequence, creating a wave of sound that rolled from one end of the impossible hallway to the other. The noise was physical, pressing against my eardrums and chest like being underwater. I walked forward because backward had ceased to be an option I could conceptualize. Each phone I passed showed a different extension calling. Some were numbers I recognized from my survey. Others were mathematical impossibilities. Negative numbers, fractions, symbols that hurt to perceive directly. At the corridor's end, which had to be somewhere outside the building's actual structure, possibly suspended in the air 7 stories above Lafayette Street, there was a final door. No number, no key needed. It opened at my touch. Inside was my apartment in Ferndale. Not a replica, my actual apartment, down to the coffee mug I'd left on the kitchen counter that morning and the pile of work boots by the door. Except the windows showed not my street, but the view from St. Bartholomew's 7th floor. And sitting on my couch, using my laptop, was someone wearing my clothes. They looked up when I entered, and I saw my face, not reflected, but worn by someone else, fitting them like a mask that had been stretched just enough to accommodate a different bone structure underneath. They smiled with my mouth, but there were too many teeth. "You're late," they said, with my voice passed through a harmonizer, creating octaves that human throats don't produce. "I've been covering your shifts for 3 weeks now." The laptop screen showed my work schedule, but the dates were wrong. According to this, I'd been working at St. Bartholomew's for 3 years. According to this, the renovation was almost complete. According to this, I lived in room 7734 and had since the building was converted. "That's not possible," I managed to say, my actual voice sounding thin and uncertain compared to the thing wearing my face. "No," it agreed, standing up with movements that were almost perfect mimicry but not quite, like motion capture with a few dropped frames. "But necessary. The building needs a caretaker, someone who knows the extensions, someone who can hear the calls." It walked past me to the door, and I saw that its footprints were size 13, maybe 14. "Your shift starts now," it said, handing me a clipboard that materialized from nowhere. The paper on it was my electrical survey, but every room was marked occupied, and every note was in my handwriting describing maintenance tasks I'd never performed. "Answer the phones. Take the messages. Make sure the rooms stay ready." Ready for what? But it was already gone, the door closing with a sound like a phone being taken off the hook. I stood in my impossible apartment in an impossible corridor in a building that was being renovated into something that had already happened, holding a clipboard full of my own handwriting documenting work I'd never done. The phone rang. Not a specific phone. All of them. Every phone in the corridor, and presumably throughout the building. A synchronized shriek that made my bones resonate. I knew with the certainty of dream logic that if I didn't answer, they would keep ringing. Forever. Growing louder. Growing closer. I picked up the nearest handset, a rotary model that predated the building itself. "Maintenance," I heard myself say, though I hadn't decided to speak. "Room 7734 needs attention," came a voice I recognized as my supervisor's, though he'd never sounded so hollow before. "The new tenant is arriving 3 years ago." I wrote it down on the clipboard, my hand moving without my conscious control, creating notes in handwriting I recognized as my own. The date at the top of the page was 3 years ago. It was also today. It was also 8 years from now when the building would be abandoned again, waiting for the next renovation, the next caretaker, the next version of someone to answer the phones that rang in rooms that didn't exist. I walked back through the corridor of phones, each step taking me deeper into a routine I'd never learned but somehow knew. The footprints in room 7735 were mine now. I recognized the tread of my boots even though they were size 13. The shadow on the wall turned to follow me, and I understood that it had always been my shadow, just from a different angle of time. In room 7734, I made the bed with corners tight enough to bounce a quarter, although I'd never learned how. I cleaned the frames that held nothing, polishing glass that would never hold pictures because the pictures were the empty space itself, potential memories waiting to be assigned to whoever came next. The phone rang. I answered. "You can come up," I said to no one, to everyone, to myself calling from 3 years ago when I'd first started working here, when I'd first never worked here, when I'd always been here maintaining the spaces between what was and what should be. I hung up and walked to the window. Detroit's skyline shifted like a flipbook. Past, present, future, never. All equally real and equally impossible. The Hudson's building fell and rose and fell again. The construction next door existed and didn't, and in the reflection, I saw myself standing in room 7734, and behind me, another me entering for the first time, and behind them, another, all the way back to a first moment that hadn't happened yet. My phone buzzed with a text from a number that was all zeros. "Your shift never ends. Your shift ended years ago. Your shift starts tomorrow. Clock in." I clocked in on an app I'd never downloaded, and my time card showed 3 years of perfect attendance at a job I'd started 3 weeks ago. My supervisor called to thank me for my dedicated service. He'd never heard of me. He'd known me since I started. He would meet me for the first time tomorrow. The building breathed around me, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, and I understood that St. Bartholomew's wasn't being converted into lofts. It was being converted into itself, over and over, a standing wave of renovation that never began and never ended, and I was its maintenance, keeping the phones ringing, keeping the rooms ready, keeping the footprints fresh in dust that accumulated and disappeared in the same moment. I answered another call. The voice on the other end was mine, asking if room 7736 was ready. I told myself it was, had been, would be. I hung up and made another note on my clipboard in handwriting I was still learning to recognize as my own, documenting work that needed to be done yesterday for tomorrow's yesterday. Outside, Detroit continued its own renovation, building and decaying at rates that made sense only if you weren't watching too closely. Inside, I walked my rounds, checking rooms that existed only when observed, answering calls from extensions that had been demolished into being, leaving footprints in dust that wouldn't settle for another 8 years ago. The phones kept ringing. They're ringing still. I answer them with voices I'm growing into, taking messages for tenants who will never arrive because they've always been here. And sometimes, when the light hits the walls just right, I see shadows of other maintenance workers, other versions, other buildings that St. Bartholomew's has been and will be. My shift continues. I've been here 3 years. I've been here 3 weeks. I arrive tomorrow for the first time. I've always been here, maintaining the impossible, keeping the extensions open, making sure the calls go through. Because someone has to. Because someone always has. Because in a building that exists in every version of itself simultaneously, consistency is just another form of chaos, and chaos is just another thing that needs maintenance. The phone is ringing. Extension 4401. A demolished room calling from the space where it used to be. I answer, because that's what I do now. Have done. Will do. Maintenance, I say with a voice that fits better every time I use it. Is it ready? Asks someone who sounds like they're learning to sound like themselves. It's always ready, I tell them. Because it's true, has been true, will be true in 3 years when they arrive yesterday. They hang up. I make a note. The building settles into itself, and somewhere in Ferndale, my apartment sits empty because I've been living in room 7734 for 3 years now, even though I've never spent a night here, even though I go home every evening to a place I've never left. The footprints in the dust grow larger every day, approaching size 14, approaching the size they've always been, and I follow them, maintaining the space between what's real and what's necessary, answering phones that don't ring for people who don't exist in rooms that aren't there. Because that's the job. That's always been the job. That's the job I applied for 3 weeks ago, that I've been doing for 3 years. that I'll start tomorrow for the first time. The extension lines keep calling, and I keep answering, and St. Bartholomew's keeps converting itself into what it's always been about to become. And somewhere, in a room that was demolished 6 months ago, a phone rings for the first time, forever, never, and always. Story 3. The Drayton Building had stood on East Bay Street for 147 years, and I'd been its night watchman for exactly 3 weeks when I first noticed the pattern. It started with the motion sensors. Every night at 2:47 a.m., the third-floor hallway would light up on my security monitor, a cascade of triggered sensors moving from east to west, methodical as clockwork. The first time I'd rushed up there, flashlight cutting through the darkness, finding nothing but dust motes dancing in the beam. The second time I moved slower, listening. The third time I stayed at my desk and watched the lights blink on and off in perfect sequence. By the end of my first month, I'd memorized the building's nocturnal rhythms. The settling of old wood at midnight, the HVAC system's death rattle at 1:15, the motion sensors at 2:47, and then, always at 3:33, a sound like breathing through the intercom system, though the building's intercoms had been disconnected in 1987. The security office occupied what used to be the building's telegraph room, tucked behind the main lobby. 3 walls of monitors showed feeds from 32 cameras, their blue glow the only light I needed most nights. The 4th wall held the old intercom panel, its brass fixtures gone green with age, wires supposedly dead behind the faceplate. That Tuesday in November, the temperature dropped 20 degrees after sunset. I remember because I'd just turned up the heat when I heard it. My own voice crackling through the dead intercom system. "Is anyone there? I need help. Please, someone." The voice, my voice, sounded distant, filtered through static and time. I stood frozen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, as the recording continued. The timestamp on the security footage read 11:43 p.m. I'd arrived at 11 p.m. sharp, like always. I set down the mug with trembling hands and approached the intercom panel. The speaker grill was thick with dust, undisturbed. When I pressed my ear against it, I heard nothing but the building's hollow silence. The next hour passed in hypervigilance. I reviewed the security footage from earlier that evening, before my shift. The cameras showed empty hallways, locked doors, darkness. At 9:17 p.m., 2 hours before my arrival, there was a flicker, just a frame or two where the third-floor camera showed something. A shadow? A figure? The image was too degraded to tell. At 2:47 a.m., right on schedule, the motion sensors triggered. This time I was ready. I'd positioned myself at the bottom of the east stairwell, waiting. The moment the first sensor activated, I began climbing, taking the steps 2 at a time, trying to match the pace of whatever moved through that hallway. The 3rd floor had been an insurance company once. Now it housed nothing but empty offices and filing cabinets full of documents nobody would ever read again. The hallway stretched the length of the building, punctuated by doors with frosted glass windows, names of long-dead employees still etched in gold leaf. I reached the top of the stairs just as the 3rd sensor triggered. The hallway lay before me, bathed in emergency lighting that cast everything in sickly green. Nothing moved. No footsteps echoed, but the sensors continued their cascade, 4th, 5th, 6th, marking the progress of something invisible toward the west end of the hall. I followed, my footsteps deliberately heavy on the worn carpet. When I reached the spot where the sensors were triggering, the air felt different, thicker. The smell hit me then, wet wood, like lumber left in the rain. Impossible. The 3rd floor had no windows, no access to the outside. The roof was sound. I'd checked it myself during orientation. The 7th sensor triggered directly above me. I looked up at it, a small white box with a red LED that should only activate when something broke its infrared beam. The light blinked once, twice, then stayed on. Through the pulse in my ears, I heard it again, the breathing through the intercoms. But this time, it wasn't coming from the security office 3 floors below. It was coming from behind the door to my left, Office 3G. According to the building plans, it had been sealed in 1994 after a pipe burst flooded the room. Nobody had bothered to renovate it. The door should have been locked, possibly even painted shut. It stood ajar by 3 inches. The smell of wet wood grew stronger. Through the gap, I could see nothing but darkness deeper than the hallway's shadows. My flashlight beam seemed to stop at the threshold, as if the darkness had substance, density. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. Inside the room, barely audible, came the sound of fingers on typewriter keys. Steady, methodical, the kind of typing that belonged to a different era, when these offices were full of life and purpose. My radio crackled. My own voice emerged from it, though I hadn't pressed the talk button. Security to base. Investigating disturbance on 3. Everything appears normal. I hadn't said those words, would never say those words. The typing continued. I pushed the door open. The office was wrong. Not destroyed or decrepit. Wrong. The walls appeared to breathe. A slow expansion and contraction that made my vision swim. Water stains covered the ceiling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a map of somewhere that shouldn't exist. In the corner, an old typewriter sat on a desk that couldn't be there. The room had been stripped of furniture decades ago. The typing stopped. In the silence, I heard my breathing echo back at me from 3 different directions, each slightly out of sync. When I stepped inside, my foot splashed in water that reflected no light. The carpet squelched, releasing the smell of decay and something else. Ozone, like the air before a storm. The typewriter held a single sheet of paper. In the green emergency lighting, I could barely make out the words, typed in an irregular pattern. 2:47 a.m. motion, detected 3rd floor. 2:47 a.m. motion, detected 3rd floor, 2:47 a.m. motion, detected 3rd floor. Security responds. Investigation. Normal security responds. Investigation. Normal security does not respond. The last line was still wet with ink. Behind me, the door swung shut with a soft click. When I spun around, the handle wouldn't turn. My radio produced only static. Through that static, faintly, I heard the intercom system activate throughout the building, my voice echoing from every speaker, having conversations I'd never had, making reports I'd never made, calling for help I hadn't yet needed. I turned back to the typewriter. A new line had appeared. Security remains. My flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, the sound of typing resumed, now coming from multiple typewriters, an orchestra of keys striking paper. The water at my feet grew deeper, colder, though I could see no source. When I finally forced the door open, it took 3 attempts, each feeling like pushing through thick curtains of air. I stumbled into a hallway that wasn't quite the one I'd left. The sensors were triggering in reverse now, west to east, converging on my position. But the truly unsettling part was the carpet, dry where my wet footprints should have been, as if I'd never entered that room at all. I descended to the security office on unsteady legs. The monitors showed normal feeds, no record of my presence on the 3rd floor despite my 20-minute absence. The logbook on my desk had a new entry in my handwriting. 3:15 a.m., routine patrol, all secure. I hadn't written it. The next 3 nights passed in escalating strangeness. The patterns became more complex. The motion sensors would trigger in impossible sequences, simultaneously on opposite ends of the hallway, or in rooms that had been walled off years ago. The intercom system played conversations between versions of myself, each discussing different emergencies, different observations, all in the same clinical security speak I'd been trained to use. By Friday, I'd started tracking the anomalies in a notebook, trying to find logic in the chaos. The building seemed to be learning my routines, anticipating my movements. If I decided to check the basement at 1 a.m., the lights would already be on when I arrived. If I planned to skip the 3rd floor entirely, the sensors would trigger frantically, like a child demanding attention. That's when I found the previous watchman's reports. They were stuffed behind the filing cabinet, water damaged and partially illegible. Different handwriting, different names, but the same observations. The 2:47 a.m. incidents, the wet wood smell, Office 3G, The final entry from each guard ended the same way, requesting immediate reassignment. The building knows. The building knows what? I wondered, then realized I'd spoken aloud. The intercom crackled to life, and my voice answered from every speaker simultaneously. The building knows its schedule. The building knows its purpose. The building knows its watchmen. I tried to quit the next morning. The property manager, a thin woman who never quite met my eyes, told me nobody had submitted a resignation. She showed me the schedule. I was signed up for the next 6 months, had apparently requested additional shifts. My signature was on every form, though I'd never seen them before. That night I arrived to find wet footprints leading from the entrance to the security office. My size, my boot tread. The monitors showed something impossible. Me, already at the desk, watching the screens. When I looked closer, the figure on the monitor turned its head toward the camera and smiled with my face. I ran. Made it 3 blocks before I realized I was still holding the building keys. Could still smell wet wood on my clothes. When I looked back, every window in the Drayton building was lit, except for the 3rd floor, which remained dark like a missing tooth in a bright smile. I returned. Of course I returned. Where else would I go at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday? This was my shift, my responsibility, my pattern to follow. The security office door was open when I arrived. The chair was warm, recently vacated. On the monitors, I watched myself patrol the building, methodical and punctual. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., 4 minutes from now. On the desk, the logbook already contained entries for the entire shift, all in my handwriting, describing a perfectly normal night. At 2:43 a.m., I understood. The building didn't just know my schedule, it was creating it. Every night it recorded my actions before I performed them, played out scenarios that hadn't happened yet, conversations from futures that may or may not come to pass. I wasn't following patterns. I was fulfilling them, acting out a script written in wet wood and static. I climbed to the 3rd floor without deciding to. My feet knew the way. Office 3G stood open, inviting. Inside, 3 typewriters clattered away, typing the same words in perfect synchronization. The watchman arrives. The watchman investigates. The watchman understands. The watchman remains. The watchman watches. The watchman is watched. The watchman was always here. The water in the room had risen to my knees, impossible and undeniable. In its surface, I saw my reflection multiplied. Dozens of me, all in security uniforms, all staring up from different angles, different times. Some were younger, some were older, some were typing at machines that shouldn't exist, in offices that were sealed, during shifts that hadn't started yet. The building had always had a night watchman, would always have a night watchman, the same watchman maybe, recycled through time, playing out variations of the same shifts, the same discoveries, the same horrible understanding that... The intercom crackled. A new voice came through, not mine, but familiar somehow, older, tired. It said, "New guard starts tomorrow. Make sure everything's ready." I looked at the typewriter. My hands were already on the keys, typing without my conscious control. Motion sensors trigger at 2:47 a.m. 3rd floor hallway, east to west. The pattern continues, outside the office. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy boots on worn carpet. The sound of someone investigating a disturbance. Someone who sounded exactly like me, moved exactly like me, but who hadn't arrived yet, wouldn't arrive for hours, or had arrived years ago. The building knew its watchman, because the building created its watchman, shaped him, recorded him, played him back in endless loops until it was impossible to tell where the job ended and the haunting began. Every guard who'd worked these nights wasn't a predecessor. They were iterations, variations, echoes of the same eternal shift. I tried to leave the office, but my reflection in the water held me in place. All of them. Dozens of hands reaching up through the impossible flood, holding my ankles with grip that felt like memory, like obligation, like the weight of every night I'd already worked and had yet to work. The typing continued. The footsteps grew closer. The smell of wet wood filled my lungs until I couldn't remember what dry air tasted like. Through the intercom, I heard myself having a conversation with the day guard, explaining that everything was normal, that the building was secure, that I'd be back tomorrow night. I would be. I always was. Even when I wasn't. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I turned to face myself, to warn myself, to explain what would happen, what had already happened, what was always happening. But when the door opened, nobody was there. Just the hollow sound of breathing through dead intercoms, and the certain knowledge that somewhere in this building, in some variation of this night, I was typing these words at a machine that couldn't exist, in a room that was sealed, during a shift that never ended. The motion sensors triggered at 2:47 a.m. They always do. They always will. And I'll always investigate even though I already know what I'll find, even though I've already found it, even though I'm still finding it right now, in Office 3G, typing words I've never written, watching myself watch myself through monitors that show nothing but the truth, that the Drayton building has one night watchman. It's always had one night watchman, and he's always been here, watching. Story 4. The first drop hit the floorboard at 11:47 p.m. I know because I was staring at my laptop screen, cursor blinking mockingly at the end of the same paragraph I'd been trying to finish for 3 hours. The sound was soft, almost gentle, like condensation falling from old pipes. Nothing that should have made my fingers freeze over the keyboard, but they did. The cabin in Vermont had seemed perfect when I'd found the listing. Remote enough that no one would bother me, rustic enough to feel authentic, modern enough to have reliable electricity and heat. The owner, speaking through a property management company, had been eager to rent it during the off-season. Too eager, maybe, but desperation makes you overlook things. I needed to finish my manuscript. 6 months overdue, publisher breathing down my neck, advance already spent. The kind of pressure that makes a man do stupid things, like rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere in late October. The second drop came 30 seconds later, then another. A steady rhythm establishing itself. Not quite regular enough to be mechanical, not quite random enough to be natural. I pushed back from the desk, the chair's legs scraping against the wood floor. The sound echoed wrong in the cabin's main room, as if the space was both smaller and larger than it appeared. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mouth dark and cold. I hadn't bothered with a fire yet, relying on the electric baseboard heaters that clicked and pinged as they worked. The drops continued, each one distinct, each one landing with a peculiar weight that suggested more than just water. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The property manager had made a point of showing me where it was, along with the candles and matches. "Power goes out sometimes," she'd said, not meeting my eyes. Storm season and all. The beam cut through the dimness beyond my desk lamp's circle of light. There, by the fireplace. The floor was wet, not pooled exactly, but marked. As I stepped closer, my breath caught. Footprints. Clear, distinct human footprints made of water, starting from beside the fireplace and leading across the room. They stopped at the edge of my workspace, maybe 3 feet from where I'd been sitting, as if something had walked from the cold fireplace to watch me work, dripping steadily as it stood there. I knelt, touched one of the prints. The water was ice cold, far colder than it should have been even in the October chill. My finger came away not just wet, but somehow oily, leaving a residue that wouldn't rub off on my jeans. The rational part of my mind kicked in. Old cabin, probably a leak. The footprint shape could be pareidolia, my pattern-seeking brain making meaning from random watermarks. I'd been stressed, underslept, overcaffeinated. This was exactly the kind of thing a tired mind would construct from ambiguous stimuli. I went to the kitchen for paper towels, but when I returned, the footprints had progressed. Not disappeared. Progressed. They now led from my desk area to the bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd left it closed. The flashlight beam trembled as I followed them. Each print was perfectly formed. Heel, arch, toes. Size 10, maybe 11. A man's foot or a large woman's. The spacing suggested a slow, deliberate pace. Someone taking their time. Someone who knew they wouldn't be interrupted. The bedroom was dark. I pushed the door fully open, flooding the space with hallway light. The footprints led directly to my bed, circled it once, then ended at the foot, as if the walker had simply ceased to exist, or had climbed onto the mattress and was lying there still, invisible and waiting. I stripped the covers off in one violent motion. Nothing. Just the bare mattress with its faded floral pattern, a relic from the cabin's last redecoration probably 30 years ago. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, laptop open but unable to write a word. The footprints dried slowly, leaving no trace by morning except for a faint mineral outline, like the ghost of evaporated salt water. I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Almost. The second night, I was ready, or thought I was. I'd spent the day in town. What passed for town out here anyway? A general store, a diner, a gas station. The elderly woman at the store's register had given me a long look when I'd mentioned where I was staying. The old Brenner place, she'd said, though I hadn't told her the address. Didn't know they were renting it again. I'd bought flour, 5 pounds of all-purpose flour. If something was walking through my cabin at night, it would leave more than just water. It would leave evidence I couldn't rationalize away. At 10 p.m., I spread the flour in a careful perimeter around my bed, another border around the desk, a third line across the threshold between the main room and the hallway. Any physical intrusion would disturb it. Any footprint would be captured in perfect detail. I pretended to work, fingers moving over the keyboard but typing nothing meaningful. Just waiting. The clock on my laptop crept toward midnight. 11:47 p.m. came and went. No drops. 11:48. Nothing. At 11:52, I heard it, but not from the fireplace. From above, a steady drip, drip, drip in the ceiling, as if someone was pouring water through the floorboards of the attic. I grabbed the flashlight and headed for the narrow stairs I'd noticed on my first day but hadn't explored. The attic door was locked. Had been locked, according to the property manager, for years. Nothing up there but old furniture and insulation, she'd said. But the sound was definitely coming from beyond it. I pressed my ear against the wood. The dripping had stopped, replaced by something else. Static soft at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable hiss of radio static, punctuated by rhythmic interruptions, like breathing. Like something breathing into a microphone, the sound processed through old speakers, distorted but undeniably organic. I tried the door again, still locked, but the doorknob was wet now, cold and slick with that same oily water. I yanked my hand back, and as I did, the static stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than sound. Back in my room, I checked the flower borders, all undisturbed. I sat on my bed, flashlight in hand, and waited. At 3:17 a.m., I woke. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had won. The flashlight had rolled from my hand, beam pointing at the wall. In its indirect light, I could see them. New footprints. They started at the fireplace again, but this time they didn't follow a straight path. They wove through the room in an impossible pattern, stepping precisely around every line of flour I'd laid. Not through, around. As if whatever made them could see my trap and had deliberately, mockingly avoided it. The prints led to my bedside and stopped, right where someone would stand to watch me sleep. The floor there was soaked, a puddle spreading that hadn't been there when I dozed off. In the puddle's reflection, lit by the flashlight's beam, I thought I saw movement. Not my movement. Something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I scrambled backward, falling off the opposite side of the bed. When I looked again, the puddle was just a puddle, but the footprints remained, their message clear. Your precautions mean nothing. I can go wherever I want. I am learning you. The next morning, if morning meant anything anymore in the perpetual gray twilight that seemed to wrap around the cabin, I found the attic door open, just slightly, just enough to suggest invitation rather than accident. The stairs beckoned. I climbed them, The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty, cramped, full of sheet-covered furniture and cardboard boxes softened by decades of humidity. But in the corner, sitting on an old steamer trunk, was a portable radio. 1960s model, the kind with a leather handle and chrome details. It was plugged into nothing, its cord coiled neatly beside it. As I approached, it turned on. Not static this time. Music. Old music. The kind my grandfather might have listened to. Big band, smooth and swaying. But underneath the orchestration, that breathing pattern persisted. In, out, perfectly timed to make my own breathing want to match it. I reached for the radio's power button. Before I could touch it, the music cut out, replaced by a voice. Not from the speakers, from behind me, from everywhere and nowhere at once. You're trying so hard to understand. I spun around. The attic was empty, but the footprints were there now, wet and fresh on the dusty floor. They circled me, a perfect spiral with me at its center. That's what I like about your kind, the voice continued. Neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Always trying to understand, always setting little traps, little tests, as if understanding would help. The radio crackled back to life. Through the static, I heard my own voice, tinny and distant. The first drop hit the floorboard at 11:47 p.m. It was reading my manuscript, the words I'd written that first night, before everything started. I've been reading along, the voice said, watching you write about me. It's almost charming how you still think you're the author here. The footprints began to move. Not new ones appearing, the existing ones, sliding across the floor like living things, reforming, creating new patterns. They spelled out words: lease, tenant, occupy. You signed a rental agreement, the voice continued, closer now, maybe right beside my ear. But you never asked who the real tenant was. I've been here so much longer than the walls, longer than the foundation. I was here when there were only trees, and I'll be here when there are only trees again. The radio started cycling through stations, fragments of news, weather, music, all from different decades. A report about Kennedy, a song from the 40s. Tomorrow's weather, impossibly specific, impossibly accurate. I don't want you to leave, it said. I want you to write. You're so much more interesting when you're creating, when you're opening those little doors in your mind. Each word you type is an invitation. Each sentence is a threshold. And I've accepted. I ran. Down the stairs, through the main room, out the front door into the pre-dawn darkness. But the voice followed, not outside but inside. Inside my skull, reverberating. You can leave the cabin, it said, amused. But you've been drinking the water, breathing the air. You've been here 3 days, and that's more than enough. I'm not bound to the building, not anymore. I'm bound to you. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys. In the reflection of the windshield, I saw them, wet footprints appearing on the hood, walking up and over, leaving that oily residue that would never quite wash off. Finish your book, the voice whispered as the engine turned over. I want to see how it ends. I want to see if you'll write the truth, that you invited me in with every word, every late-night session, every moment you opened your mind and let the darkness pour onto the page. I drove. 20 miles, 50, 100. At a rest stop, I checked into a motel, convinced I'd escaped. But when I opened my laptop to delete everything I'd written, to purge the manuscript and start over, I found new chapters. Chapters I hadn't written, in my style, my voice, describing everything that had happened, but from another perspective. The perspective of something that had been watching far longer than 3 days. The final line of the newest chapter read, "The writer thinks he's alone in this motel room, but the water dripping in the bathroom says otherwise." I looked up. From under the bathroom door, a thin line of water was creeping across the floor. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, forming letters as it spread. Keep writing. I'm writing this now from another location. It doesn't matter where. It finds me. The footprints appear every night at 11:47, no matter where I sleep. The radio signals follow me, breaking through car stereos, televisions, even my phone. Sometimes I hear my own voice reading words I haven't written yet, stories that haven't happened but will. The manuscript is almost complete. Not the one I came to Vermont to finish. A different one. One that tells the truth about spaces between spaces. About things that inhabit emptiness. About contracts we sign without reading the fine print of reality. I've stopped trying to determine if it's real. That's the wrong question. The right question is, when you open your mind to create, what else do you let in? When you bare your consciousness to pull stories from the dark, what looks back? The water is dripping again. It's 11:46 p.m. where I am now, though I'm no longer sure if time means what I thought it meant. In 60 seconds, the footprints will appear. They'll walk to where I'm sitting, and they'll wait. They always wait now, patient as gravity, inevitable as erosion. I'll finish the manuscript tomorrow, or maybe I already have. Sometimes I find chapters I don't remember writing, perfect in their horror, beautiful in their implications. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the writer anymore, or just another character in something else's story. The drops have started. It's 11:47 p.m. It's always 11:47 p.m. somewhere. And somewhere, if you listen carefully to the static between radio stations, you can hear me typing. Forever. Story 5. The casino never sleeps, but something in it dreams. I've worked security at the Silver Dollar in Reno for 7 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Drunks, cheats, prostitutes, desperate souls betting their last dollar on red or black. The cameras see all, and I see through the cameras. 32 monitors in the surveillance room, each one a window into someone else's desperation or delusion. But nothing prepared me for what the cameras started showing me 3 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday night, slow for October. The high roller floor was nearly empty, just a few regulars nursing their whiskey and working the blackjack tables. I was scanning the feeds, fighting the hypnotic rhythm of slot machines bleeding through the walls, when movement on monitor 17 caught my eye. A woman in a red coat, walking down the 7th floor hallway of the hotel tower. Nothing unusual about that, except for how she moved. Not the confident stride of a guest heading to their room. Not the tired shuffle of someone coming back from the tables. She moved like smoke, fluid and somehow wrong, as if the camera couldn't quite capture her properly. The image seemed to blur at her edges, pixels struggling to define where she ended and the hallway began. I zoomed in, but her face remained turned away, hidden beneath waves of dark hair. She stopped at room 717 and entered without using a keycard. The door simply opened for her. I radioed my partner downstairs. Check on 717. Guest just entered. Might be a malfunction with the lock. 5 minutes later, he called back, breathing hard from the climb. Doors chained from inside, but nobody's answering. Want me to get management? Hold on. I pulled up the feed from the camera inside 717's hallway entrance. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The room was dark, but I could make out shapes in the green-tinted night vision. Furniture covered in sheets, a thick layer of dust on every surface. The bathroom door hung open, revealing broken tiles and exposed pipes. The room's under renovation, I said slowly, staring at the monitor. Has been for months. Then who the hell chained it? I rewound the hallway footage. The woman in red walked backward out of the room, her movements unnaturally smooth in reverse. But when I played it forward again, she was there, entering 717 like before. I checked the timestamp, 11:47 p.m. Same as the current time. But that was impossible. I'd been watching for at least 10 minutes. The next morning I pulled the guest registry. Room 717 showed as occupied, but the name made my skin crawl. The guest was listed as checked in on October 15th, 2019, then October 15th, 2016, then 2013, 2010, 2007. Always the same date, always the same room, always the same name that I couldn't quite read. The letters seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. I printed the screen, but what came out wasn't the registry. It was a grainy image from a security camera. Me, from behind, staring at the monitors. In the reflection of the screen in front of me, barely visible, was a figure in red standing directly behind my chair. My hands shook as I checked the current camera feed showing the surveillance room. I was alone. I spun around, nothing but empty chairs and the hum of electronics. When I looked back at the printout, it had changed. Now it showed me turning around, my face a mask of confusion and fear. But in the corner of the frame, just at the edge of visibility, a red sleeve. I started keeping a log, trying to make sense of it. Every night at 11:47 p.m., she appeared on monitor 17, walking that same hallway. I tried switching the feeds, but she'd appear on whatever monitor I assigned to that hallway. I tried not watching at all, but the compulsion was overwhelming. At 11:46, my eyes would be drawn to the screen like iron filings to a magnet. The printouts got worse. Each one showed me from angles that didn't match any camera in the building. Me in the parking garage, looking over my shoulder. Me in the break room, frozen mid-bite of a sandwich, eyes wide with terror at something outside the frame. Me in my car in the employee lot, slumped over the steering wheel. Always, somewhere in the image, a hint of red, a reflection in a window, a shadow that didn't match the lighting, a blurred figure at the very edge of perception. I stopped sleeping. How could I, when every time I closed my eyes, I saw those impossible photographs? I started seeing red in my peripheral vision during the day, a flash in the mirror when I shaved, a figure at the bus stop that vanished when I turned to look. The sensation of being watched became constant, a weight between my shoulder blades that no amount of checking behind me could ease. Then came the night I decided to confront it directly. At 11:45 p.m., I left the surveillance room and took the elevator to the 7th floor. The hallway stretched before me, identical to how it appeared on the monitors, but somehow more oppressive in person. The carpet pattern seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. 11:46. I stood outside room 717, hand on my radio, waiting. 11:47. The air temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. The door to 717 swung open, revealing darkness so complete it seemed solid. And from that darkness, she emerged. The woman in the red coat stood before me, but her face, God, her face was wrong. Not disfigured or monstrous, just unfinished. Like a portrait where the artist had given up halfway through, leaving features suggested but not defined. Her eyes were dark smudges that nonetheless conveyed infinite sadness and terrible hunger. She held out her hand, and in it was a room key. Not a modern key card, but an old brass key with a worn tag reading 717. I found myself reaching for it, my hand moving against my will, when my radio crackled to life. "Where the hell are you? You're on 17 monitors at once." The spell broke. I stumbled backward, and the woman's unfinished face contorted into something like disappointment. She stepped back into the darkness of 717, and the door slammed shut. When I tried the handle, it was locked and chained from inside. I ran back to the surveillance room, my partner staring at me with wide eyes. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the monitors. Every single screen showed the same image. Me, standing in the 7th floor hallway. But I wasn't alone. In each feed, from every angle, the woman in red stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her incomplete face turned toward the camera. And in each image, I was smiling. "That's not what happened," I whispered. She was in front of me, not beside. "What are you talking about? You've been sitting here all night. You never left the room." I looked at the timestamp on the monitors, 11:47 p.m. I looked at my watch, 11:47 p.m. I looked at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. Time stuttered. I blinked and it was 11:48. The monitors showing their normal feeds. My partner gone. When had he left? I couldn't remember. I reached for my coffee mug and found it full, though I distinctly remembered finishing it an hour ago. At the end of my shift, I cleaned out my locker, ready to quit, to leave Reno, to never set foot in the silver dollar again. But when I reached into my jacket pocket for my car keys, my fingers closed on something else. A folded piece of paper I didn't remember putting there. I unfolded it with trembling hands. Written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew was mine. Room 717, return. Below that, a date. October 15th. I checked my phone. October 14th, 11:59 p.m. As the date changed, I felt something shift inside me. A sensation like déjà vu in reverse. Not the feeling of having been here before, but the certainty that I would be here again. I drove home in a daze, the steering wheel cold under my hands despite the heater running full blast. In my apartment I found more notes, all in that same handwriting that was and wasn't mine. Remember to forget. The camera sees what needs to be seen. You've always been watching. I called in sick the next night, and the next. But on the third night, October 17th, I got a call from my supervisor. "Where were you yesterday?" "You were scheduled." I called in sick for the 15th and 16th. "The 15th? You worked the 15th. I've got you on camera right here in the surveillance room. Want me to send you the footage?" The email came through before I could respond. I opened the video file with shaking fingers. There I was, sitting in my usual chair, monitoring the feeds. The timestamp read, October 15th, 11:47 p.m. On monitor 17, the woman in red walked down the 7th floor hallway. And in the surveillance room, on camera, I stood up, walked to the printer, and pulled out a photograph. But I was still sitting in my chair. Both of me. One watching, one moving, existing simultaneously in the same space. The me at the printer turned to look directly at the camera, holding up the photograph. Even in the grainy footage, I could make out what it showed. Me, in my apartment, right now, watching this very video. In the background, barely visible, a figure in a red coat standing in my bedroom doorway. I spun around. My bedroom door was closed. When I looked back at my laptop, the video had ended, replaced by a single frame. Room 717's door, standing open, darkness beyond. I knew then that I would go back. Tonight, tomorrow, last week, next year. Time had become negotiable, and I was no longer certain which version of me was the original, or if that distinction even mattered anymore. The woman in red wasn't haunting the hotel. She was showing me what I'd always been. A ghost watching ghosts. A security guard securing nothing but shadows. Forever walking the same hallways. Forever watching the same feeds. Forever printing the same impossible photographs. I looked at my phone. October 15th, 10:30 p.m. My shift started in 30 minutes. It had always started in 30 minutes. It would always start in 30 minutes. I put on my uniform, the fabric cold against my skin, and drove to the Silver Dollar. The parking lot was full and empty simultaneously, my car the only one there and one of hundreds. The building flickered between new and old, pristine and decrepit, real and reflected. In the surveillance room, I sat in my chair and watched the monitors. At 11:47 p.m., she would appear. She always appeared. And I would watch and print the photographs and find the note in my pocket and return to room 717 again and again, each loop adding another layer to the palimpsest of my existence. The woman in red wasn't the ghost. I was. Or maybe we both were, trapped in the casino's endless dream, watching and being watched, the camera seeing all but understanding nothing. The monitors flickered, showing past and present and future all at once, and I realized with a kind of numb acceptance that I couldn't remember when I'd started working here, or what my life had been before, or if there had ever been a before at all. On monitor 17, the woman in red began her walk down the 7th floor hallway. I reached for the printer, knowing what would come out, what had always come out, what would always come out. The photograph of me, watching myself, an infinite regression of surveillance and haunting. In my pocket, my fingers found a folded piece of paper. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. Room 717, return. The clock read 11:47 p.m. It always did. Story 6. The map was wrong from the beginning, but I didn't notice until the signal died. I'd bought it at a truck stop outside Topeka, one of those yellowed road atlases from the 80s that nobody uses anymore, not with GPS and smartphones. The old woman behind the counter had pushed it toward me with trembling fingers when I'd asked for directions to bypass construction on I-70. Her eyes had that milky quality that made you wonder if she could see you at all, but she'd tapped the atlas twice and muttered something about finding your way. $3 seemed fair for nostalgia. Now, 18 hours into my haul, somewhere between nowhere and less than that, my phone showed no bars, and the CB crackled with static that sounded almost like breathing. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and Kansas stretched around me like an ocean of darkness, punctuated only by my headlights cutting through the void. I'd pulled over to check my position the old-fashioned way. The cab's dome light cast shadows that danced as I unfolded the atlas across the steering wheel. That's when I saw them, thin blue ink marks tracing a route across the Kansas highways. My route, today's route. The pen marks showed my departure from the distribution center in Kansas City at 5:30 a.m. They tracked my stop at the Flying J near Lawrence for coffee, black, no sugar. They marked the way station I'd passed through at mile marker 234. Every turn, every merge, every moment of my day drawn in precise, careful strokes. But there were other marks too. A circled X at a rest stop I'd never visited, time-stamped 2:15 p.m. A notation for fuel at a station 20 miles north of my actual route, marked 6:45 p.m. These phantom stops continued past my current location, trailing into tomorrow with the same methodical precision. The static on the CB shifted, forming almost words. I reached for the handset, then stopped. The atlas page flickered in the dome light, or maybe my eyes did. When I looked again, a new mark had appeared. A small star at a location 15 miles ahead, labeled simply, Arrival 12:23 a.m. My hands felt disconnected from my body as I shifted into gear. The engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the seat and into my spine. I told myself I'd just drive past whatever was there, confirm it was nothing, then find a motel and sleep off whatever exhaustion was making me see things. The 15 miles passed in what felt like seconds and hours simultaneously. My speedometer read a steady 65, but the landscape outside seemed to blur and stretch. The yellow lines merged into a continuous stream. Stars above wheeled in patterns that made my stomach turn if I glanced up too long. Then I saw it. A gravel turnoff marked by a faded sign I couldn't read in the darkness. My headlights swept across it as I slowed, revealing a dirt road that disappeared into a cluster of trees. Every rational part of my brain screamed to keep driving, but my hands turned the wheel without my permission. The road wound through skeletal trees for maybe a quarter mile before opening into a clearing. What I found there made my foot slip off the accelerator. 12 semi-trucks sat in perfect formation, arranged in a rectangle around an empty central space. All identical to mine, same company colors, same model year. Their running lights glowed amber in the darkness, casting long shadows across the dirt. The engines were silent, but somehow I could feel a vibration in the air, as if they were running on a frequency below human hearing. I stopped at the edge of the formation and killed my engine. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It was the kind of complete absence of sound that made your ears ring. No insects, no wind. Even my breathing seemed muted. The CB crackled to life. Unit 47, check in. My unit number, my voice on the radio, but I hadn't transmitted. Unit 47, confirming arrival at checkpoint 7. The voice continued with my exact inflection, my slight Midwest accent, even the way I cleared my throat before speaking. But the words were wrong. I'd never been to checkpoint 7. Movement in one of the trucks caught my eye. Through the driver's side window, illuminated by the cab's interior light, I saw a figure. Dark hair like mine. Same company jacket. The figure turned, and even from 50 feet away, I recognized the profile. One by one, interior lights flicked on in the other trucks. 12 versions of myself, sitting in 12 identical cabs. all turning to look at me with expressions I couldn't read through glass and distance. The CB crackled again, but this time 12 voices spoke in unison. My voice multiplied and overlapping. Route deviation detected. Please return to designated path. My hands shook as I reached for the atlas. The blue ink marks had changed. Now they showed 12 different routes, all originating from this clearing, spreading across Kansas like veins. Each route was labeled with dates, some past, some future. One showed tomorrow. Another showed last Tuesday, a day I remembered driving but couldn't quite recall the details. The 12 voices continued their chorus through the radio. Compliance required for route completion. Deviation creates redundancy. I looked back at the trucks. The versions of me were moving now, going through the motions of driving, hands on steering wheels, checking mirrors, adjusting dials. But the trucks remained stationary. They moved with the mechanical precision of a memory being replayed over and over. The atlas grew warm in my hands. New marks appeared as I watched, showing a route from this clearing to a destination 3 states away. A delivery I was supposed to make tomorrow. But the timestamp showed it had already been completed, yesterday, by Unit 47. A knock on my passenger door made me jump. Another me stood outside, face partially obscured by the angle of the light. This version looked tired, worn down by miles I hadn't driven yet. He held up a logbook, pages fluttering despite the still air. Every page showed the same route, the same stops, the same signatures, but different dates. Some entries were in my handwriting, others were in slightly different styles, as if I'd forgotten how to form certain letters. The radio burst with static, then cleared. Integration protocol initiated. Please remain stationary. The other truck's engines suddenly roared to life in perfect synchronization. Their headlights blazed, turning the clearing into a harsh tableau of light and shadow. The versions of me inside began to fade, becoming translucent, their movements slowing like film running at half speed. I turned the key in my ignition. Nothing. Turned it again. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over. The me outside my passenger door had pressed his face against the glass. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. His eyes, my eyes, were wide with something between warning and resignation. He held up the logbook again, and I could see the last entry. Route completed. Driver integrated. Unit 47 operational. The date was tomorrow. The atlas in my lap began to bleed ink. The blue lines spread across the page like veins, forming new patterns, new routes that spiraled and interconnected. Names of cities I'd never heard of appeared and disappeared. Timestamps overlapped, showing simultaneous arrivals at locations hundreds of miles apart. Through the windshield, I watched the other trucks begin to move. They rolled forward in formation, maintaining perfect spacing, their lights creating a hypnotic pattern. But the versions of me inside were gone now. Just empty cabs with lights on, driving themselves in an endless circle around the clearing. My CB clicked on without my touch. Unit 47, this is dispatch. Your location shows anomalous. Please confirm position. The voice was different this time. Not mine, but familiar somehow. Official, corporate, the kind of voice that called when you'd violated company policy. I grabbed the handset, my voice cracking. This is 47. I'm at... I stopped. Where was I? The GPS showed nothing. The atlas showed everywhere. Unit 47. Our records indicate you completed your route 6 hours ago. You're currently logged as off-duty. Please explain your status. 6 hours ago, I'd been driving through western Kansas, but the logbook on my dashboard, when had that appeared, showed a completed delivery signature and timestamp from 6 hours ago, in my handwriting, for a destination I hadn't reached yet. The trucks had completed their circle and stopped, facing inward now, their lights focused on my truck. The me outside had stepped back, rejoining the formation. He stood with 11 others in the spaces between the vehicles, all watching, all waiting. The radio continued. Unit 47, we show multiple instances of your ID active in the system. This is a violation of... Static consumed the transmission. The lights in the other trucks flickered in sequence, creating a strobe effect that made my vision swim. In the moments of darkness between flashes, I saw things that couldn't be there. Glimpses of highways I'd never driven, rest stops in states I'd never visited, signatures on deliveries for companies that didn't exist. The atlas had become something else entirely. The pages turned on their own, showing not maps, but logs. Thousands of entries, all in my handwriting, documenting decades of routes. Past the dates I'd been hired, past the dates I'd been born, future dates that stretched into years I'd never see, all signed by Unit 47. My phone buzzed. One bar of signal, flickering. A text from a number I didn't recognize. You're off route. Return to path or forfeit completion. Another buzz. Previous Unit 47 has been archived, position available. And another. Accept integration? YN. The 12 versions of me moved closer, their footsteps synchronized into a single sound. They weren't threatening, just patient, waiting for me to understand something I couldn't quite grasp. I looked at the atlas again. There, in the corner of the page, was a note I hadn't seen before. My handwriting, but older somehow. The ink faded. The route doesn't end. It just repeats. We all drive the same roads, make the same stops, until we realize we always have. You're not lost. You're exactly where you've always been. The engine turned over without my key. The dashboard lit up with routes. Not one, but dozens, all overlapping, all identical, all different. The GPS showed my location as everywhere and nowhere. The clock read 12:23 a.m., just as the atlas had predicted. The 12 versions of me nodded in unison, then began walking back to their trucks. One by one, they climbed into their cabs and pulled away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the clearing. Only the one who'd knocked on my door remained. He approached my driver's side window, and I found myself rolling it down. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in his features, my features, from driving routes that never ended, making deliveries that had already been made, would be made, were being made right now. He spoke, and his voice was mine but older, worn thin. The company never tells you about the redundancy system. Backup drivers for backup drivers. We all think we're the original until we find the clearing. He handed me a business card through the window. My name, but the employee ID number was different. The hire date was wrong. The photo was me, but older, or younger. I couldn't tell anymore. Drive the route, he said. Complete the delivery. Don't think about which version you are. They all end up here eventually. He walked back to the last empty truck and climbed in. The engine started, and he pulled away, leaving me alone in the clearing with just my headlights piercing the darkness. I looked at the atlas one more time. The blue ink had settled into a single route now, one that led from here to my destination, then to another, then another, in an endless chain that wrapped around the country like a net. Every stop was marked with the same timestamp. Now. The CB crackled. Unit 47, please proceed to designated route. My voice, but also not my voice. The voices of all the 47s who had sat in this seat, who would sit in this seat, who were sitting in this seat right now in other clearings, in other states, in other versions of the same night that kept repeating. I put the truck in gear. The clearing disappeared in my mirrors as if it had never existed. The atlas showed I was back on I-70, heading west, exactly where I should be. The phone had signal again, full bars. The clock read 10 p.m., as if the last 2 hours hadn't happened. But the business card remained on my dashboard. And sometimes when I glance at the atlas, I see new blue marks appearing. Routes I'll drive tomorrow that I've already driven yesterday. Stops I'll make that I've already made. Versions of myself passing in the opposite direction. All of us hauling the same load to the same destination. Forever. The radio chatters with phantom transmissions. Check-ins from Unit 47 at locations across the country. All happening now. All in my voice. Dispatch never questions it. The logs always match. The deliveries always arrive on time. I drive through Kansas in the deep night, following the blue ink that appears just before I need to turn, stopping at stations that exist only when I need fuel. signing logs that have already been signed. Sometimes I pass other clearings, see the glow of gathered trucks in the distance, and wonder which version of which driver is discovering what they've always known. The route doesn't end. It just continues, spreading across the map like veins, like roots, like the branches of decisions that all lead to the same destination. We're all driving the same road, just at different times that are all the same time. I am Unit 47. I've always been Unit 47. I will always be Unit 47. And somewhere in Kansas, in a clearing that exists when it needs to, another version of me is buying a yellowed atlas from an old woman with milky eyes, not knowing he's already driven this route, will drive this route, is driving this route right now. The parallel lines on the highway stretch into the darkness ahead, converging at a point that never gets closer no matter how far I drive. The atlas sits on my passenger seat, pages rustling with roads that write themselves. I check the mirror and see headlights behind me, maintaining perfect distance. Unit 47, following Unit 47, followed by Unit 47, in an endless procession of the same truck driving the same route through the same eternal night. The CB whispers with the sound of my own breathing, transmitted from 1,000 cabs across 1,000 highways. All of us alone, all of us together, all of us driving through the darkness with maps that show us where we've been by showing us where we're going. And in the silence between transmissions, I can hear the hum of engines that aren't there, the echo of routes that haven't been driven yet, the sound of parallel roads running alongside this one, just out of sight, just out of reach. Always there, always here, always now. Story 7. The foghorn shouldn't have been working. I stood at the base of Heseda Head Lighthouse, my recording equipment heavy in my backpack, watching the abandoned structure pierce through the Oregon coastal mist like a bone through skin. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1963, its power lines severed, its keeper's quarters boarded up. Yet at 3:47 a.m., I heard it, a low, thrumming frequency that made my teeth ache and my recording meters spike into the red. I'd driven 6 hours from Portland to capture the ambient sounds of coastal fog. My YouTube channel, modest as it was, had garnered a following among insomniacs and ASMR enthusiasts who craved authentic environmental recordings. The plan was simple. Set up my Zoom H6 near the lighthouse, capture the interplay of wind and waves against the structure, maybe catch some interesting resonances from the hollow tower. What I found instead was impossible. The frequency pulsed at exactly 17 hertz, just below the threshold of human hearing, but powerful enough to feel in your chest. My equipment registered it clearly, a perfect sine wave that shouldn't exist without electrical input. As I adjusted my windscreen and checked the levels, something else emerged from the static. Don't turn. The words materialized in my headphones like condensation on glass. I spun around, scanning the empty clifftop trail behind me. Nothing but fog and the distant crash of waves against basalt. I rewound the recording. The phrase was there, clear as daylight at the 4:13 mark. A whisper riding underneath the impossible frequency, speaking in what sounded disturbingly like my own voice. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent years studying acoustics and audio engineering, tried to explain it away. Pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random noise, like seeing faces in clouds or hearing voices in white noise. But when I played it back a third time, the words had changed. Don't light it. My hand was halfway to my phone's flashlight when I heard it. I hadn't even consciously decided to illuminate the path ahead. The thought had barely formed, yet the recording had anticipated it, warned against it. My fingers trembled as I lowered the device. The fog grew thicker as I climbed the trail toward the lighthouse, each step accompanied by that persistent 17 hertz drone. My boots crunched on wet gravel, the sound sharp and immediate in the muffled world of mist. The lighthouse loomed larger, its white walls stained with decades of salt and neglect. Windows black as pupils stared down at me. I set up my primary recording station 20 feet from the base of the tower, where the frequency was strongest. The LED meters on my equipment danced in hypnotic patterns, recording something that shouldn't exist. As I fine-tuned the input levels, I noticed something else. A pattern within the drone, almost like Morse code but more complex, more organic. Wait, this time I didn't need to play it back. The word emerged from the frequency itself, shaped from the interference patterns between the drone and the ambient environment. It knew. Somehow it knew I was about to approach the door. The entrance to the lighthouse was supposed to be sealed, had been sealed for 60 years according to my research. But as I stood before it, recorder in hand, I saw that the padlock hung open, its hasp corroded but recent scratches gleaming in the metal. The door itself was slightly ajar, darkness seeping out like oil. That's when I saw the notebook. It lay on the ground just inside the threshold, its pages rippling in a breeze that shouldn't have existed in the still air of the foggy night. Even from where I stood, I could see it was a field journal, identical to the one in my backpack. Same brand, same color, water damaged and swollen, as if it had been here for days. I reached for it, and the frequency shifted, modulated into something almost like speech. Don't read tomorrow. My hand froze. Tomorrow? The phrase made no sense, yet something about it filled me with a dread I couldn't name. I grabbed the notebook anyway, its pages cold and damp against my fingers. The first entry was in my handwriting, dated tomorrow, October 15th, 4:23 a.m. The pattern is clearer now. The frequency isn't coming from the lighthouse, it's coming through it. A standing wave between 2 points in time. I can hear myself from yesterday warning me about today. But if I'm hearing yesterday, then yesterday must be hearing. The entry cut off mid-sentence. I flipped through the pages, each one covered in my distinctive scrawl, documenting events that hadn't happened yet. Observations about sounds I hadn't recorded, discoveries I hadn't made. And throughout, a growing sense of panic that bled through the clinical language. October 15th, 5:45 a.m. The door was always open, will always be open. Time doesn't flow here. It pools, eddies, reverses. The warnings aren't from the lighthouse. They're from me. I'm trying to stop myself from another incomplete entry. My hands shook as I turned to the final written page. October 16th, 3:47 a.m. I understand now. The frequency is a loop, a Mobius strip of sound folded through time. Every warning I hear is one I will speak, have spoken, am speaking now. The only way to break the cycle is to never begin it. But I've already begun. I began tomorrow. I begin yesterday. If anyone finds this, know that the door must stay closed. Not the lighthouse door, the other one. The one that opens when you finally understand what you're really hearing in the static. I looked up from the notebook to find myself standing inside the lighthouse. I didn't remember entering, didn't remember climbing the rusted spiral staircase that now stretched above me into darkness. The frequency was deafening here, a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums and made my vision blur. My recorder was still running, had been running this entire time. When I checked the timeline, it showed 6 hours of recorded material. That was impossible. I'd only been here for 40 minutes. The waveform on the display showed something that made my stomach turn. My own voice, speaking continuously for hours, warning myself about things I was about to do, had already done, would never stop doing. Don't go up. But I was already climbing, my feet moving of their own accord up the spiral stairs. Each step rang out with a metallic echo that seemed to arrive before my foot touched the metal. The sound of my breathing came from above and below simultaneously, as if multiple versions of myself were climbing the same stairs at different moments, all of us converging on the same point. The lamp room at the top was empty except for the broken Fresnel lens, its prismatic surface catching light that didn't exist. Through the shattered glass, I could see the ocean, but it was wrong. The waves moved backward, foam dissolving into smooth water, spray falling upward into clouds. That's when I noticed the second door. It shouldn't have been there. The lamp room was circular, with windows on all sides. But set into the curved wall, between two windows, was a door that hurt to look at directly. It seemed to exist in a space that the lighthouse didn't actually contain, as if someone had folded the geometry of the building to create room for it. The notebook in my hand, when had I started carrying it, fell open to a new page. Fresh ink spelled out words in my handwriting. The door is already open. Has always been open. You opened it tomorrow. You're opening it now. I approached the impossible door, my reflection in its surface showing someone I didn't recognize, older, haggard, with eyes that had seen too much. The reflection was holding a notebook too, but reading from it, not writing in it. Its mouth moved, and I heard my own voice emerging from the 17 hertz frequency. I tried to warn myself, but warnings only work if time moves in one direction. Here, every warning becomes an instruction. Every instruction becomes a memory. Every memory becomes a prophecy. The door doesn't open onto another room. It opens onto another when. My hand reached for the doorknob. Or had it always been reaching? Would it ever stop reaching? The metal was warm, pulsing with that same 17 hertz frequency that had drawn me here, that was drawing me here, that would draw me here. Behind the door, I could hear myself screaming, or laughing, or both. The sound came from yesterday and tomorrow simultaneously, a temporal harmony that human ears were never meant to perceive. I could hear myself recording this moment from outside the lighthouse, warning myself not to enter. I could hear myself in the future, reading from a notebook that documented everything I was about to experience. I could hear myself in the past, driving toward the lighthouse, unaware of what was waiting. The door began to open, or had it always been opening? Time folded and refolded around this moment like origami made of seconds and hours. Through the widening gap, I saw myself standing on the other side, recorder in hand, looking back at me with eyes full of terrible understanding. "Don't listen to the warnings," the other me said. Or maybe I said it, or maybe we both said it at the same time. They're not trying to stop you. They're ensuring it happens. Every warning is a breadcrumb leading you here, to this moment, to this door that exists in the space between seconds. I wanted to run, but my future self had already documented that I wouldn't. Couldn't. The notebook told the story of my next few hours in devastating detail. How I would stand here, frozen, as time continued to fold around me. How I would eventually understand that the frequency wasn't being broadcast from the lighthouse, but through it. A signal from somewhere else, someone else, using the abandoned structure as an antenna between moments. The fog outside was lifting, but instead of revealing the ocean, it revealed more lighthouses. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Each one a different version of Hesed ahead from different timelines, all of them converging on this point. In some, I could see myself arriving. In others, leaving. In one, I stood at the top, looking down at another version of myself looking up. My recorder was still running, capturing everything, creating a record that I would find tomorrow when I arrived here for the first time. The warnings I was recording now would be the ones I heard then, thinking they were trying to protect me, not knowing they were the very things that would lead me to this moment. The other me, the one beyond the door, held up his notebook. Today's date. No. Yesterday's date. No. Tomorrow's. The dates kept shifting, the ink rearranging itself as I watched. "The frequency isn't a warning," he said, or I said, or we would say. "It's an invitation, and you already accepted it. You accepted it the moment you decided to come here, which was decided the moment you heard the recording you're making right now." I understood then. The door wasn't an exit or an entrance. It was a mirror, reflecting not space, but time. And I wasn't looking at another version of myself. I was looking at myself from tomorrow, looking back at myself from yesterday. We were the same person, separated by hours that had become meaningless in this place where causality had twisted into a Klein bottle. The notebook in my hand was getting heavier, filling with more entries, documenting experiences I hadn't had yet but remembered having, would remember having, was remembering having now. The ink was my blood, my sweat, my tears, transformed into words that described a future that was also the past. "You can leave," the other me said, smiling with my mouth. You do leave. You have left. You will leave. But you also return. Are returning. Have always been returning. The recording you're making ensures it. I backed away from the door, but I could feel time pulling me forward, toward a tomorrow that had already happened, was happening, would always be happening. The lighthouse stairs spiraled both up and down simultaneously now, and I was climbing and descending at the same time, my footsteps echoing from past and future, converging on a present that no longer had meaning. Outside, I could hear my car arriving. I could hear myself unpacking my equipment, excited about the atmospheric recordings I was about to capture. The 17 hertz frequency wasn't coming from the lighthouse. It was coming from me. My heartbeat stretched across time, creating a standing wave in the present that manifested as sound. The notebook's final entry was writing itself as I watched, my hand moving without my control. There is no escape because there is nothing to escape from. There is no trap because the trap is existence itself in a place where time has no direction. The lighthouse isn't abandoned. It's inhabited by every moment of everyone who ever comes here, all existing simultaneously. I am here. I was here. I will be here. The door is open. The door is closed. The door is opening now. Forever now. Always now. I ran down the stairs that led up, through the door that was closed while being open, past myself arriving and leaving. The fog swallowed me, but I could still hear the frequency, still feel it in my bones. My car was where I'd left it. The equipment in the back showed recordings I hadn't made yet, days of material documenting my time in the lighthouse, a time that hadn't ended, wouldn't end, couldn't end. I drove away, but the road curved back toward the lighthouse. I took a different route, but it led to the lighthouse. I stopped driving, but I was already at the lighthouse, had always been at the lighthouse, would always be at the lighthouse. The notebook on my passenger seat fell open to a blank page. Words appeared in my handwriting. You think you've left, but leaving is just another part of arriving. The recording you made will be uploaded, will be heard, will draw others. Some of them are you. All of them are you. The frequency spreads not through space, but through time, and everyone who hears it becomes part of the standing wave, the temporal interference pattern that manifests as sound, but is really something else, a fold in causality where all moments exist at once. I pulled over at a rest stop. My phone showed messages I hadn't received yet, thanking me for recordings that had helped them sleep, helped them find the lighthouse themselves. The frequency was still there, faint, but persistent. 17 hertz. The sound of time itself when it stops flowing and starts pooling. In my rearview mirror, I saw myself driving toward Hesed ahead. We made eye contact across time, and I knew this was just another loop, another moment between leaving and arriving. The notebook's pages fluttered without wind, showing entries from dates that hadn't happened yet. The door remains open. If you're reading this, you've already walked through it. The warnings you hear are your own voice, echoing across time. The frequency calls, has always called, and you already answered. I turned off my recorder, but it kept recording. I closed the notebook, but the words kept writing themselves. I drove away from the lighthouse, but I was already there, standing at its base, listening to a sound that shouldn't exist, reaching for a door that should be closed, reading a notebook I hadn't written yet. The fog rolled in again, or had it ever lifted? Time meant nothing here, where warnings became invitations, invitations became traps, traps became home. Somewhere, in another, when that was also now, I heard myself unpacking recording equipment, excited about the atmospheric sounds I was about to capture at an abandoned lighthouse on the Oregon coast. I wanted to warn myself, but I already had, and I would again, forever. Story 8. The first boot print appeared 3 days into my temporary assignment at Glacier National Forest. I'd taken the ranger position out of desperation. Bills don't pay themselves. and the regular guy had vanished during his 4 a.m. rounds 2 weeks prior. Nobody talked about it directly, but I caught fragments of hushed conversations in the station's break room, words that dissolved like morning mist whenever I approached. I found the print on the Hidden Lake Trail during my afternoon patrol, pressed deep into the mud beside a fallen log. My exact boot, Danner Mountain Light 2, size 11, with that distinctive crack across the left sole I'd been meaning to repair. But the wear pattern was wrong. Where my heel wore down on the inside edge from years of pronation, this print showed wear on the outside. A perfect mirror image. I crouched beside it, my breath catching in the thin mountain air. The morning rain had left the ground soft, preserving every detail. Even the small gouge where I'd stepped on broken glass last month was there, but on the opposite side of the sole. My hand trembled as I placed my boot beside the impression. Identical, yet reversed. The forest pressed close around me, Douglas firs stretching into a canopy so thick that perpetual twilight reigned beneath. I'd grown up in cities, Chicago, then Denver, and the wilderness still felt alien after 3 days. Every shadow could hide something. Every sound carried meaning I couldn't decipher. I followed the prints. They led deeper into the woods, away from the marked trail. Each step matched my stride length exactly. Where I would naturally place my foot to avoid a root or rock, the prints did the same. It was like following my own ghost. Or maybe I was the ghost following something more real than myself. The trail curved left around a massive cedar, and I stopped. I knew this tree. I'd passed it 20 minutes ago, heading in the opposite direction. The bark pattern was unmistakable, like a face screaming in silent agony. But that was impossible. The Hidden Lake Trail didn't loop back on itself. I checked my GPS. The coordinates showed me a quarter mile from where I'd started, exactly where I should be. But the tree insisted otherwise. I touched its bark, rough and real beneath my fingers, and felt the world tilt slightly, as if gravity had suddenly remembered it could choose different directions. The boot prints continued past the tree, and against every instinct, I followed. The forest began to feel wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Sounds arrived before their sources. The crack of a branch that wouldn't break for another heartbeat. The rustle of leaves that hadn't yet been disturbed by wind. My radio crackled with static that formed almost words, syllables that resembled my name spoken backwards. Then I emerged onto the trail exactly where I'd first found the prints. I stood there, staring at the fallen log, at the depression in the mud that now showed 2 sets of prints. Mine approaching from the trail, and the reversed ones leading into the woods. The path I'd just taken through the forest should have led me miles away, not in a circle. My GPS still showed me a quarter mile out. The radio at my hip burst to life. My own voice emerged from the speaker, reading a report I'd written that morning about wildlife activity near the visitor center. But the words were wrong, subtly altered. Where I'd written, "no unusual activity observed," my voice said, "significant disturbance patterns noted." Where I'd documented all trail markers intact, the voice reported, "multiple markers missing or reversed." I grabbed the radio, about to respond, when I realized the transmission was coming from inside the station, from my desk. I could hear the familiar squeak of my chair, the distinctive tap, tap, tap I made with my pen when thinking. The sun was setting, painting the mountains the color of dried blood. I needed to get back, to confront whatever was sitting at my desk, using my voice. But when I turned to head down the trail, the boot prints had multiplied. Dozens of them now, all mine, all reversed, creating a path that led in every direction at once. I chose what looked like the main trail and started walking. The familiar landmarks were there but wrong. The informational sign about local wildlife faced the wrong direction, its text reversed as if seen in a mirror. The bench where hikers usually rested was on the opposite side of the trail. Every step felt like walking through thick syrup, reality resisting my movement. The radio crackled again. This time, it was dispatch calling for a status report. I raised the device to respond, but the voice that emerged wasn't quite mine. Close enough that dispatch wouldn't notice, but I heard the difference. A slight hollow quality, like an echo preceding itself. All clear on the hidden lake trail. Returning to station now. I hadn't spoken. The words had simply emerged from my radio, from my throat that hadn't moved, from lungs that hadn't exhaled. Dispatch acknowledged with routine disinterest. By the time I reached the station, full dark had settled over the forest. The building glowed with familiar fluorescent harshness, a beacon of normalcy in the wilderness. Through the window, I could see my desk, could see someone sitting there, hunched over paperwork. The figure's hand moved across the page with my exact writing style, that same tap, tap, tap of the pen when pausing to think. I stood in the parking lot, key in hand, unable to move forward. The figure at my desk continued writing, occasionally reaching for the coffee mug. My mug, the one with the chip on the handle, and taking a sip. Everything about the movement was mine, but viewed as if through a mirror. The radio crackled one more time. The voice, my voice but not my voice, spoke clearly. "Johnson, you're late for the 4 a.m. rounds. The previous ranger never showed up." I looked at my watch. It showed 7:47 p.m., but the numbers seemed to shimmer, wanting to be something else. The parking lot lights flickered, and in that strobe-like moment I saw myself standing at the entrance, looking in at myself in the parking lot, looking in at myself at the entrance, creating an infinite regression of observers and observed. The next morning, or was it the same morning recurring, I woke in my temporary quarters behind the station. My alarm showed 3:30 a.m., time to prepare for the early rounds. The duty log on my nightstand had entries in my handwriting that I didn't remember making. They documented issues I hadn't encountered, decisions I hadn't made, all painting a picture of negligence that would justify what? My disappearance? My replacement? I dressed mechanically, noting that my boots now showed wear on the outside of the heel. When had that happened? The mirror in the small bathroom reflected someone who looked like me, but whose movements felt a fraction of a second off, as if the reflection was leading rather than following. The radio on my belt already showed signs of heavy use, though I'd barely touched it since arrival. The channel was set to a frequency I didn't recognize, and when I tried to change it, my fingers moved to keep it exactly where it was, following a muscle memory that wasn't mine. Outside, the forest waited in pre-dawn darkness. The trail to begin the 4 a.m. rounds stretched ahead, and I could see fresh boot prints in the frost. My boots walking a path I hadn't taken yet, or had taken yesterday or would take tomorrow. Time felt negotiable here, a suggestion rather than a rule. I thought about the ranger who'd disappeared, wondered if he'd stood exactly where I was standing, seeing his own prints leading into the darkness. Had he followed them? Had he become them? Was he still out there, walking circuits that folded back on themselves, filing reports that reported themselves, existing in a loop that pretended to be linear? The duty required me to walk the trail. Everything in me screamed to run, to get in my truck and drive until the forest was a memory. But my feet moved forward, following the prints that were mine but reversed, or reversed but mine. The distinction had stopped mattering. As I walked, I heard footsteps matching mine, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always exactly my pace. The radio occasionally burst to life with reports in my voice, documenting things I was simultaneously doing and not doing. The GPS showed me in 3 locations at once, all of them correct. I reached the fallen log where it had all started, or would start, or was starting. New prints appeared as I watched, pressed into the earth by invisible weight. They led in a direction I hadn't chosen, but my feet followed anyway, as if the trail itself was making decisions for me. The forest path twisted in ways that defied topology, leading me through spaces that shouldn't connect. I passed the same tree from different angles simultaneously, saw my own back disappearing around corners I hadn't reached yet. Reality had become negotiable, and I wasn't the one negotiating. Then I understood, with the clarity that comes from accepting the impossible. I wasn't being replaced or duplicated. I was being prepared. The previous ranger hadn't disappeared. He'd been folded into the patrol itself, becoming part of the recursive loop that maintained these trails. And soon, at 4 a.m., when the next version of me arrived for duty, I would fold too, adding my observations to an endless report that documented itself. walking trails that existed in parallel, maintaining a forest that maintained its maintainers. The radio crackled one last time. A new voice, uncertain and worried, asked for a status update. I heard myself respond from 3 directions at once, all slightly out of sync. All clear. Beginning the 4 a.m. rounds. I looked at my watch. 3:59. Almost time to disappear or appear, or continue appearing and disappearing in a cycle that had no beginning, because it had no end. My boot prints stretched ahead and behind, a perfect mirror of steps I had taken, was taking, would take. In the distance, I heard a car pulling into the station parking lot. The new temporary ranger, probably. Desperate for work. Unaware that the position wasn't really temporary at all, I wanted to warn them. But my voice was already busy filing reports. All of them true, none of them real. The trail curved ahead into darkness. I followed my own footsteps into it, knowing that somewhere behind me, or ahead of me, or beside me in a parallel track, I was following myself. An endless recursion of rangers maintaining a forest that existed in more dimensions than maps could show. At exactly 4 a.m., I synchronized with myself, and the forest sighed with satisfaction. Story 9. In the mirror arrived with the apartment, a massive thing with a tarnished bronze frame that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The previous tenant had left it behind, along with a stained mattress and a refrigerator full of expired condiments. I'd thrown out everything else, but something about that mirror made me hesitate. Maybe it was the weight of it, or how the Art Deco patterns in its frame perfectly matched the building's original moldings. Or maybe it was just that moving it would have required help, and I'd just relocated to Chicago knowing exactly no one. My new place occupied the 7th floor of the Belmont building, a 1928 Art Deco masterpiece that had somehow survived both urban renewal and gentrification with its original details intact. The apartment itself was a time capsule. Hexagonal floor tiles, glass doorknobs, radiators that clanged like ghost prisoners. The mirror hung in the bedroom, taking up most of the wall opposite my bed. In the mornings, I'd catch myself staring at my reflection, noting how the old glass made everything look slightly amber, as if viewed through aged whiskey. The disappearances started small. My watch, a cheap Timex I'd worn since college, vanished from the nightstand where I always left it. I tore the apartment apart looking for it, checking between couch cushions, under the bed, even in the refrigerator. Stranger things had happened, during late-night snack runs. Nothing. 3 days later, I noticed something in the mirror that made my skin crawl. There was my watch, clear as day, sitting on the reflected nightstand. But when I turned to look at the actual nightstand, it wasn't there. I approached the mirror slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The watch in the reflection didn't move. Its hands were frozen at 3:17, the exact time it had stopped working months ago, which was why I'd stopped wearing it regularly. I reached out to touch the glass, and as my fingers made contact, the image sharpened. The reflected room came into focus with startling clarity, and that's when I noticed the differences. The bedspread in the mirror was dark green instead of blue. A leather chair sat in the corner where I had nothing but empty space. The walls held paintings I didn't own, abstract pieces that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And there, on the bed in the reflection, was an open suitcase I'd never seen before, filled with clothes that looked like mine, but weren't quite right. The patterns were off. The colors were inverted. Everything was familiar, yet fundamentally wrong. I pulled my hand back, and the image blurred again into a normal reflection. My heart hammered against my ribs as I backed away from the mirror. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, I dreamed of falling through glass into rooms that multiplied infinitely, each one a slightly corrupted copy of the last. The next item to disappear was my Cubs cap, a gift from my father before he'd stopped speaking to me. It vanished from its hook by the door and reappeared in the mirror world, hanging on a coat rack I didn't own. Then my keys went missing, only to show up in the reflection, attached to a keychain I'd never seen before. a small bronze octopus that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. I started documenting everything. Every disappearance, every reappearance, every subtle difference I noticed in the mirror world. The reflected apartment was becoming more detailed with each passing day, as if it were feeding on the objects it took from me, using them to build itself into something more complete. The furniture in the mirror world was always slightly better than mine. The couch looked newer, the kitchen appliances gleamed, even the plants, which I didn't have, appeared lush and well-maintained. 2 weeks into this madness, I decided to experiment. I wrote a note on a post-it, "Who are you?" and stuck it to the mirror before leaving for work. The day crawled by. I couldn't focus on spreadsheets or client calls. My supervisor asked if I was feeling all right. Apparently, I'd been staring at my blank computer screen for 20 minutes. I made an excuse about a migraine and left early. The response was waiting for me when I got home. The post-it was still where I'd left it, but now there was another one beside it. The handwriting made my blood run cold. It was mine, not similar to mine, not a close approximation, but absolutely, undeniably my own handwriting. Even the way I curved my H's and crossed my T's was perfect. I'm you. The better version. I stood there for a long time, reading those 5 words over and over. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the mirror like grasping fingers. The radiator clanged its evening song, but the sound felt muffled, as if coming from very far away. I wrote back, "What do you want?" The next morning the response was there. To trade places. Just for one night. The notes continued for days. Each exchange revealed more about my mirror counterpart. He claimed to be trapped, though he wouldn't say how or why. He knew things about me, memories I'd never shared with anyone, the name of my childhood dog, the scar on my knee from falling off my bike when I was 7. But there were differences too. He mentioned a promotion I'd never received, a girlfriend I'd never met, a version of my life where things had gone right instead of wrong. "Your world is the real one," he wrote once. "Mine is just a reflection. Let me feel something solid again." I found myself sympathizing with him despite every rational part of my brain screaming warnings. The loneliness in his messages mirrored my own, pun unintended but unavoidable. Here I was, alone in a new city, talking to what was either a supernatural entity or a hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. Neither option was particularly comforting. The disappearances accelerated. My coffee mug, my favorite pen, the book I'd been reading, all vanished and reappeared in the mirror world. But now I noticed something else. The objects in the reflection looked more real than the ones in my room. They had a weight to them, a substance that my actual possessions seemed to lack. When I looked at my real nightstand, it appeared faded, like a photocopy of a photocopy. The mirror world was gaining resolution while mine was losing it. I started spending hours in front of the mirror, studying the other apartment. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement, a shadow passing through a doorway, a curtain fluttering without wind. Once, I swear, I saw myself in the background, walking past the bedroom door in the reflection while I stood perfectly still in front of the glass. The other me didn't look at the mirror. He moved with purpose, like someone comfortable in their space, at home in a way I'd never felt. The notes became more insistent. "Tonight, please. I'll return everything. You won't even notice the difference. I'm so tired of watching." That last one made me step back from the mirror. Watching. How long had he been watching? Since I moved in? Before? Had the previous tenant left because of this? Or had they traded places already? I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, dragging my mattress to the living room instead. But I could feel the mirror's pull, even from there. A gravitational force that made my thoughts drift toward it during every quiet moment. My work suffered. My few attempts at making friends in the city fell flat. How could I explain that I couldn't go out because I needed to watch my mirror? 3 weeks after the first disappearance, I woke up to find something new. A key on my nightstand. Not one of mine, but the one I'd seen in the mirror world, attached to that unsettling bronze octopus keychain. The metal was cold to the touch, colder than the morning air could account for. The octopus's tiny tentacles seemed to curl around my fingers as I picked it up. There was another note on the mirror, a gesture of good faith. This opens doors you can't see yet. I should have thrown the key away. Should have covered the mirror, or smashed it, or moved to a different apartment. Instead, I found myself walking through my apartment, trying the key in every lock. It didn't fit any of them. But when I stood in front of the mirror and held the key up, I saw its purpose. In the reflection, there was a door in my bedroom wall that didn't exist in my world. A narrow door painted the same color as the walls, so well hidden that I'd never noticed it before. The other me was standing in front of it, key in hand, waiting. That night I wrote, "What happens if we trade?" The response came immediately, as if he'd been waiting with pen in hand. "You get the life you were supposed to have. I get to remember what food tastes like. And we can trade back? Of course, anytime you want." I knew he was lying. Every instinct, every self-preservation reflex in my body knew it was a trap. But I was so tired. Tired of the empty apartment, the failed fresh start, the weight of every wrong turn I'd taken to end up here. The other apartment looked so much better, cleaner, warmer, more like a home than a temporary shelter. I stood in front of the mirror that night, watching my reflection. He watched back, and for the first time, I was certain we were moving independently. He raised his hand when I didn't. He smiled while I frowned. The distance between us was just a thin sheet of glass, but it might as well have been an ocean. "How?" I asked aloud, my voice cracking from disuse. He pressed his palm against his side of the glass. I knew what he wanted me to do. Every horror movie I'd ever seen, every warning bell in my head, told me not to touch the mirror. But loneliness is its own kind of horror. And sometimes the monster you know seems better than the emptiness you're living with. I pressed my palm against the glass. The cold hit first, a numbing freeze that shot up my arm and into my chest. Then came the pulling sensation, as if the mirror had become liquid and was drawing me in. I tried to step back, but my hand was stuck. The reflection smiled wider, and I noticed his teeth were all wrong. Too many, too sharp, arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. "Wait," I started to say, but the pulling intensified. The glass didn't break. It bent, stretched like taffy, wrapping around my arm. I watched in horror as my reflection stepped back, free, while I was drawn forward. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and I was falling through it, through endless layers of glass and reflection, each one showing a slightly different version of my apartment, my life, myself. I landed hard on carpet. My carpet, but not. Everything was reversed, wrong-handed, like living inside a photograph's negative. The air tasted metallic. Colors were shifted just enough to be nauseating. And there, on the other side of the glass, stood the other me, or what I'd thought was me. Up close, in my world, he looked even less like me than he had in the mirror. His proportions were subtly wrong. Fingers too long, eyes too wide, a smile that stretched further than anatomy should allow. He picked up his keys from the nightstand and pocketed them. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was mine but played backward, each word ending where it should have begun. "I'll take good care of your life." I rushed at the mirror, pounding on it with both fists. But from this side, it was solid as stone. He waved, a casual, mocking gesture, and walked out of the bedroom. I heard the front door open and close. The apartment fell silent except for my ragged breathing and the distorted clanging of radiators that now sounded like laughter. I was trapped in the reflection, in this almost right apartment where everything was familiar but fundamentally corrupt. The food in the refrigerator looked normal but tasted like chalk. Water ran upward from the faucets. The windows showed Chicago, but the skyline was wrong. Buildings that shouldn't exist, streets that curved impossibly, a sun that never quite set but hung at the horizon like a watching eye. I've been here for time moves differently. Could be days, could be years. The mirrors on this side show nothing, just empty rooms devoid of life. But sometimes, if I press my face against the glass and squint just right, I can see through to the real world. I watch him living my life, going to my job, sleeping in my bed. He's better at being me than I ever was. His smile convinces people. His words come easier. He's even fixed things with my father somehow. I leave notes on the glass, begging anyone who can see them to help, to not trust him, to break the mirror. But who would believe them? Who looks closely enough at their reflection to notice the person trapped behind it? Sometimes new people move into the building. I watch them through their mirrors, trying to warn them. A few have noticed. A child who waved back once, an old woman who covered her mirror with a sheet after seeing me. But most don't look, don't see, don't want to see. The worst part isn't the isolation or the backward world, or even the knowledge that something inhuman is wearing my life like a suit. It's the realization that I can feel myself changing. My fingers are growing longer. My smile stretches wider each day. The reflection is remaking me, transforming me into what it needs for the next trade. Because I understand now. This isn't a prison. It's a waiting room. Someday, someone else will move into an apartment with an old mirror. They'll notice things disappearing. They'll find notes in handwriting that looks just like theirs, and when they finally press their palm against the glass, I'll be ready. I'll be the better version of them. I practice my smile in the empty mirrors, perfecting it for when my turn comes. It's almost right now. Too many teeth. Yes, but arranged in patterns that are beginning to make sense. The bronze octopus key sits heavy in my pocket, waiting to open doors that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder about the one who trapped me. How many trades had he made? How many lives had he worn and discarded? Was there an original person at the beginning of this chain? Or have we always been here? Infinite reflections reflecting nothing, each one a little less human than the last. The radiator clangs its backward song. Through the mirror, I can see someone new looking at apartments in the building. Young, alone, desperate for a fresh start. The landlord is showing them my old unit, his unit now. They're admiring the Art Deco details, the original moldings, the character. They haven't noticed the mirror yet, but they will. Story 10. The scanner's blue light swept across another yellowed document at 2:47 a.m., and I watched my name materialize in the metadata where it shouldn't exist. Not typed by me. Not now. The timestamp read 3 weeks from today. I'd been working the night shift at the museum for 8 months, digitizing collections that hadn't seen daylight since the 1940s. The Egyptian wing sprawled empty around me, emergency lights casting long shadows between display cases. My workstation sat in what used to be a restoration room, surrounded by climate-controlled cabinets and the persistent hum of dehumidifiers. The scanner, a massive flatbed unit that cost more than my annual salary, connected to a computer that should have been replaced years ago. That's when the anomalies started. At first, I dismissed them as database glitches. Files would appear in the digitization queue with my credentials attached, cataloging items I hadn't processed yet. The descriptions were meticulous. Canopic jar, Middle Kingdom, hairline fracture developing along base, estimated manifestation, Tuesday. When I checked the physical artifact that Tuesday, the fracture was there, exactly as described. The computer itself was unremarkable, a standard workstation running our proprietary archival software. But something had changed after the last system update. Files began appearing with increasing frequency, each one time-stamped days or weeks ahead, each one bearing my digital signature. They weren't just catalog entries anymore. They were warnings. I found the water damage report on a Thursday. According to the file I hadn't created, moisture would infiltrate the West Wing's climate control system in 6 days. The description included humidity readings, mold spore counts, and a precise list of artifacts that would suffer irreversible damage. The author field showed my name. The modification date showed the following Wednesday. My supervisor barely glanced at my concerns when I brought them to her attention the next morning. She was reviewing grant proposals in her office, surrounded by towers of paperwork and cold coffee. I explained about the files, the timestamps, the predictions. She suggested I take a few days off, mentioned the employee assistance program, but when I showed her the water damage report on my laptop, her expression shifted. The West Wing hadn't had moisture problems in 15 years. They installed the sensors that afternoon. 6 days later, at 2:03 a.m., every alarm in the West Wing screamed. A pipe had burst inside the walls, exactly where the file had indicated. We saved every artifact on the list. After that, they paid attention. The files kept coming, structural assessments of display cases that would fail, security vulnerabilities that wouldn't be discovered for weeks. Each document appeared with my name attached, created by credentials I'd never used. At times, I hadn't been in the building. The IT department ran every diagnostic they could think of. They replaced the computer twice. The files still appeared. I started staying later, watching the screen, waiting for the moment when these documents materialized. I'd sit in the restoration room with its fluorescent glare and recycled air, listening to the building settle around me. The museum at night had its own vocabulary of sounds. The tick of climate controls, the distant shuffle of security guards, the whisper of air through ventilation shafts. But lately, I'd been hearing something else. A soft scratching, like pencil on paper, coming from inside the walls. 3 weeks into the phenomenon, I found a file that made my hands shake. It wasn't about an artifact or structural damage. It was about me. The document, dated 2 weeks in the future, contained medical records I didn't recognize. Brain scans showing abnormalities in my temporal lobe. Test results for conditions I'd never heard of. The physician's notes mentioned temporal displacement syndrome and chronesthetic aphasia. Terms that yielded no results when I searched for them. The scratching in the walls grew louder. I started documenting everything. Screenshots, printouts, video recordings of my screen as new files appeared. The pattern was always the same. A brief flicker of the monitor, a momentary freeze of the cursor, then the file would simply exist in the directory as if it had always been there. The creation timestamp showed my login, but the security logs never recorded my access at those future times. The museum's director assembled a team, IT specialists, consultants, even a professor of theoretical physics who specialized in temporal anomalies. They set up equipment around my workstation, electromagnetic field detectors, temperature sensors, cameras recording from every angle. They watched me work, took notes, whispered among themselves. The physics professor kept asking about my dreams, whether I'd noticed any gaps in my memory, if time ever felt elastic or compressed. The files grew more urgent. They described a catastrophic failure in the building's foundation, scheduled for next month. An electrical fire in the archive room. A breach in the hermetically sealed storage where we kept the papyrus scrolls. Each prediction came with my name, my credentials, my digital fingerprint on documents I'd never touched. But the cost was becoming apparent. I'd lose moments. I'd be scanning a document and suddenly it would be 20 minutes later, the work completed, files uploaded with timestamps I didn't remember creating. My handwriting appeared in notebooks I didn't recall opening. Post-it notes in my workspace bore messages in my script. Check the basements. The archive knows. Stop feeding it. The scratching inside the walls followed me home. I heard it in my apartment, in my car, in the spaces between thoughts. It sounded like something trying to write its way out of confinement, or maybe write its way in. The professor had a theory. He spoke about information paradoxes, about data that exists outside conventional time streams. He suggested the computer had become a conduit, that somehow the museum's vast collection of historical artifacts had created a temporal sensitivity. The past pressing against the present, the future bleeding backward through digital channels. He used terms like chronological porosity and temporal membrane degradation. But I knew better. The files weren't predictions. They were demands. Each warning we heeded, each disaster we prevented, Something was taken in exchange. Not from the museum, not from the artifacts. From me. I could feel it in the gaps between heartbeats, in the moments where I existed and then didn't, where I was present and then retroactively absent. The system wasn't helping us preserve the past. It was feeding on the present, consuming moments of now to pay for glimpses of later. The medical files date approached. I hadn't seen a doctor, hadn't scheduled any appointments, but my temporal lobe throbbed with a pain that felt like remembering things that hadn't happened yet. The scratching in the walls had become constant, a ceaseless scribing that seemed to originate from somewhere beneath reality's surface. On the night before the medical files timestamp, I returned to the museum. The restoration room was dark except for the scanner's standby light and the glow of the monitor. I sat at my workstation and waited. At exactly 2:03 a.m., always 2:03 a.m., the screen flickered. A new file appeared. This one was different. It wasn't about the museum or its artifacts. It was about the system itself. Pages and pages of text describing something that existed between digital and physical, between now and later, between is and was. The document described how it had always been here, in the gaps between catalog entries, in the spaces between pixels, in the pauses between keystrokes. It had been waiting in the museum's vast archive of time-frozen objects, feeding on the chronological weight of millennia-old artifacts. The text explained that every prediction came with a price, moments of existence erased from the timeline, retroactively removed from history. Each warning we acted upon created a debt that had to be paid in temporal currency. The system wasn't protecting the museum, it was protecting itself, ensuring its continued existence by making itself indispensable. I realized then why the files always bore my name. I wasn't the author, I was the medium. The system needed someone to bridge the gap between digital prophecy and physical reality. Each file it created through me thinned the barrier between what was and what would be. The scratching in the walls wasn't something trying to get out or in. It was the sound of time itself being rewritten. The final pages of the document described what would happen if I stopped cooperating. The museum would suffer catastrophic losses. Priceless artifacts would be destroyed. Years of preservation work would be undone. But more than that, all the moments the system had already consumed would collapse back into the present simultaneously. Every prevented disaster would occur at once, compressing weeks of averted catastrophes into a single, impossible instant. I sat in the restoration room, surrounded by the weight of ancient history, and understood my position. I could continue feeding the system moments of my existence, watching myself fade from timestamps and memories, becoming less real with each prediction we prevented. Or I could stop, and watch everything we'd saved be destroyed in a temporal implosion that would make the losses meaningless anyway. The scanner's light pulsed softly, waiting for the next document. On the monitor, a new file was already forming, tomorrow's crisis taking shape in today's pixels. My name appeared in the author field letter by letter, as if being typed by invisible hands, or perhaps by hands that wouldn't exist until next week. I reached for the next artifact to scan, a clay tablet covered in cuneiform script. As the blue light swept across its surface, I wondered if the ancient scribes who'd pressed these marks into wet clay had felt something similar. The weight of recording things that hadn't happened yet, the burden of preserving futures that might never come to pass. The scratching in the walls synchronized with my heartbeat. Or maybe my heartbeat had synchronized with it. Time in the restoration room felt thick, viscous, like swimming through history itself. The file on my screen continued writing itself, using my credentials, my access, my rapidly diminishing presence in the timeline. I thought about the medical report dated for tomorrow, the brain scans showing abnormalities that didn't exist yet. Maybe they never would. Maybe I was dissolving into the space between timestamps, becoming as ephemeral as the predictions that bore my name. The system needed an interface between digital and physical, between prediction and prevention. It had chosen me, or perhaps I'd chosen it by sitting at this workstation 8 months ago, by being the first to notice the patterns in the prophecies. The museum stood silent around me, 5 floors of carefully preserved history pressing down like sediment. Every artifact had been pulled from time's flow, frozen in climate-controlled suspension. Now I understood why the system had emerged here, in this place where past and present existed side by side, where ancient objects sat meters away from modern technology. The boundary was thinner here. The membrane between was and will be had worn translucent. Another file appeared, then another. They came faster now, cascading into existence with timestamps stretching weeks, then months into the future. Each one bore my name, my digital signature on documents describing disasters I'd never see, warnings I'd never consciously write. The system was accelerating, consuming larger chunks of my temporal presence to fuel its expanding appetite for prediction. I stood up from the workstation, my movement triggering the motion sensors. The restoration room filled with harsh light. On the monitor, files continued materializing, a waterfall of future catastrophes demanding prevention. My name appeared again and again, an endless repetition of identity being spent like currency. The scratching in the walls reached a crescendo, then stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something else. The sound of fingers typing on a keyboard that wasn't there, or wasn't there yet, or had been there but was being retroactively removed. I looked at my hands. They were moving, entering data I wasn't consciously controlling. The screen filled with text I didn't remember writing, descriptions of artifacts I hadn't cataloged, predictions of damages that hadn't manifested. I was becoming the system's ghostwriter, a temporal secretary taking dictation from tomorrow. The medical file's timestamp arrived and passed. I felt no different, but when I looked at the security footage from an hour ago, my image flickered, translucent in some frames, absent in others. The system had collected its payment. I existed less today than I had yesterday, would exist even less tomorrow, but the museum would survive. The artifacts would remain preserved. History would continue to be protected from a future that increasingly included less and less of me. I returned to my desk and continued scanning. The blue light swept across ancient surfaces while the monitor filled with tomorrow's warnings. Each file demanded its price, each prediction its pound of temporal flesh. I paid it willingly now, understanding at last that this was what preservation truly cost. Not money or effort, but existence itself, traded away moment by moment to keep the past safe from the future. The scratching returned, softer now, almost companionable. It sounded like pencil on paper, like history being written one disappeared moment at a time. I wondered who would sit at this workstation when I'd fed the last of my timeline to the system. Would they notice their name appearing on files they hadn't created? Would they feel the walls beginning to scratch? The scanner hummed, waiting, always waiting. I placed the next artifact on the glass and watched the blue light sweep across centuries, while somewhere in the walls, tomorrow continued writing itself into existence, using what remained of my today as ink. Story 11. The first time I noticed the cold draft at 3:47 a.m., I convinced myself it was the building settling. Old foundations in Boston have their quirks. Everyone knows that. But when it happened the second night and the third, always at the exact same minute, I started paying attention. I'd rented the basement apartment on Commonwealth Avenue 3 weeks ago. Desperate for cheap space after my divorce cleaned me out. The landlord, an elderly woman with clouded eyes who never quite looked at me directly, had warned me about the building's personality. I'd laughed it off then, told her I wasn't superstitious. Now, sitting in the darkness with my phone showing 3:46 a.m., waiting for that inevitable rush of Arctic air, I wasn't laughing anymore. The draft always came from the same direction, down the narrow corridor that connected my living space to what I'd turned into a makeshift office. It moved with purpose, if wind could have such a thing, snaking along the baseboards before rising to extinguish every light source in its path. LED bulbs, candles, even the glow from my laptop screen, everything went dark for exactly 11 seconds. I'd counted, every single time. Tonight I'd prepared. Fresh plaster covered a section of wall near my office door where I'd noticed cracks forming. If there was a structural issue causing the draft, the plaster would show it. I sat in my desk chair, angled to watch both the corridor and the wall, my phone recording. 3:47 a.m. The temperature plummeted first. My breath misted in the air as frost spread across the inside of the windows that were supposed to be double-paned and insulated. The familiar darkness swept through, and I counted under my breath. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. At 7 seconds, I heard it. Not the draft itself, but something moving within it. Footsteps. No, not quite footsteps. More like the sound of wet fabric dragging across hardwood, punctuated by a rhythmic pressing that could have been steps. The sound stopped directly outside my office door. 11 seconds. The lights flickered back. My hands trembled as I checked the fresh plaster. 5 handprints pressed into the surface, still glistening with moisture despite the bone-dry air. They were large, larger than mine by at least 2 inches, and angled upward as if someone had been pulling themselves along the wall. The thumb on each print bent at an impossible angle, nearly perpendicular to the palm. I played back the phone recording. The video showed nothing unusual, just me sitting in the dark, counting. But the audio, God, the audio. Those dragging sounds were there, along with something else I hadn't heard in person. Breathing. Labored, wet breathing that grew louder as it approached my door. And then, just before the 11 seconds ended, a whisper. My name, spoken with such urgency it sounded like a warning, or a plea. The next morning, I tried to rationalize. Old buildings have drafts. Plaster can form patterns when it dries unevenly. Audio recordings pick up ambient noise our ears filter out. I almost convinced myself until I went to leave for work and found my keys on the hallway floor outside my apartment. I'd left them on the kitchen counter. I was certain of it. The door had been locked from the inside, the deadbolt still engaged when I went to open it. Someone had been inside. Someone who could move my keys through a locked door. I started leaving the door unlocked after that, better to know than to wonder. Each morning, the keys appeared in a different spot outside, sometimes a few feet down the hall, once at the top of the basement stairs. Never in the same place twice, but always within sight of my door, like breadcrumbs, like an invitation. The handprints multiplied. Every few days, new ones appeared in fresh plaster, always during those 11 seconds of darkness. I stopped replastering. The wall looked diseased now, covered in overlapping palm prints that seemed to tell a story I couldn't read. They clustered densest around a particular spot about 3 feet from the floor, as if someone kept trying to push through the wall itself. By the second week, I'd established a routine. Every night at 3:40 a.m., I'd position myself in the corridor with my phone recording, a flashlight in one hand, and a digital thermometer in the other. I documented everything. The temperature drop, always exactly 23 degrees. The duration of darkness, always 11 seconds. The path of the draft, always the same snake-like pattern along the floor. But routines breed complacency, and complacency makes you miss things. It was a Thursday when I first noticed the schedule. Not mine, theirs. Whoever or whatever shared this space with me knew my patterns better than I did. They knew I left for work at 8:15 a.m., returned at 6:30 p.m. They knew I showered at 10 p.m., made coffee at 6 a.m. They knew because the handprints had started appearing at those exact times too. Just single prints. Always fresh. Always watching. I tested it, broke my routine, left for work at 7 a.m. one day. When I came back, a single handprint had appeared on my office door, right at 8:15 a.m., when I should have been leaving. The next day I stayed home sick. At 8:15 a.m. sharp, I heard my front door's deadbolt turn. The door didn't open, but the lock cycled through its motion as if phantom fingers were testing it. The recordings became more disturbing. The whispers grew clearer, though no more comprehensible. They weren't speaking English, weren't speaking any language I recognized. The sounds were too wet, too hollow, like someone trying to speak through water or mud. But the urgency was unmistakable. And always, always my name buried somewhere in that aquatic babble. I started sleeping in the corridor. I told myself it was for research, to better understand the phenomenon. The truth was simpler. I couldn't bear not knowing anymore. If something was moving through my apartment at night, I needed to see it. For 3 nights, nothing changed. The draft, the darkness, the whispers, all exactly as before. But on the 4th night, at 3:47 a.m., in those 11 seconds of absolute darkness, I felt it. A hand, cold, wet, impossibly large, settled on my shoulder. The fingers were too long with too many joints, and they gripped with a pressure that wasn't quite solid, as if the hand existed somewhere between states of matter. It pulled gently, insistently, toward the wall where all those handprints clustered. When the lights returned, my shoulder was soaked through. The fabric of my shirt disintegrated in a perfect handprint shape. The skin underneath was pale, almost translucent, and cold to the touch. It took 3 days for the feeling to return to that area, and even now, weeks later, that part of my shoulder never quite warms up. I should have left then. Any rational person would have. But rationality had abandoned me somewhere between the first recording and the 15th handprint. I needed to understand. So I did something stupid. I followed the pattern. The handprints weren't random. When I mapped them out, they formed a path. From the corridor wall to my office, around the desk, to a spot in the corner where the floor met 2 walls. That corner had always felt wrong, colder than the rest of the basement, with a subtle lean to it as if the building were slowly folding in on itself. At 3:40 a.m., I positioned myself in that corner. I waited. 3:47 a.m. came with its familiar proclamation of cold and darkness. But this time, in those 11 seconds, the corner opened. Not physically. The walls remained solid to my desperate, grasping hands. But something about the space unfolded, revealing depth where none should exist. In that impossible depth, I saw it. Or rather, I saw the impression of it, like looking at a shadow cast by something standing in front of a light you couldn't see. It was human-shaped but wrong, stretched in places, compressed in others. It moved toward me with that same wet, dragging sound from my recordings. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind like ice crystals forming on glass. It knew my name, my schedule, my fears. It knew because it had been watching, waiting, learning. It had been here first, before the building, before the city, before humans had names for the dark spaces between walls. The basement wasn't its prison, it was its observation post, and I wasn't its subject, I was its replacement. It showed me things in those eternal 11 seconds. Other basements, other buildings, all connected by the spaces between walls. A network of watchers, documenting the patterns of the living with the patience of the dead. They needed anchors, it explained without words. Living minds to tether them to this side of reality, to keep the passages stable. The previous tenant had lasted 43 years before the cold finally claimed him. The one before that, 62 years. They didn't die. Death would break the connection. They just faded, became part of the infrastructure. Their consciousness spread thin across the network of invisible corridors. When the lights returned, I was alone in the corner, my body covered in handprints that weren't mine. They've never washed off. They're part of me now, or I'm part of them. The boundary isn't clear anymore. I still live in the basement. I can't leave. I've tried. Every attempt ends with me back in that corner at 3:47 a.m., covered in new handprints, my memory of trying to escape already fading like a dream. The entity doesn't visit anymore. It doesn't need to. We have an understanding now, or rather I understand my role. I document everything. The times, the temperatures, the patterns. I leave my keys outside my door each morning. A signal that I'm still here, still watching, still tethered. The handprints on the wall have stopped multiplying. They were never warnings or intrusions. They were instructions, showing me where to stand, where to watch. How to become part of the architecture of surveillance. My phone recordings have changed. I still hear the whispers, but now I understand them. They're not speaking to me. They're speaking through me. Every night at 3:47 a.m., for 11 seconds, I broadcast my observations into the network. I don't remember what I say. I don't want to. The landlord visited last week, those same clouded eyes still not quite focusing on me. But this time, I understood why. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me, at the thing I'm becoming. She asked if the building's personality was treating me well. I told her yes, and I meant it. Because I finally understand. I didn't rent this basement. It rented me. The cold doesn't bother me anymore. My shoulder has spread its numbness down my arm, up my neck. By winter, maybe spring, I'll be translucent enough to see the walls through my skin. The previous tenant lasted 43 years. I wonder if I'll beat his record. I've stopped locking my door. There's no point. The thing that lives in the corridor between spaces doesn't need doors. Neither do I. Not anymore. We share the same schedule now, the same purpose. Every night at 3:47 a.m., we synchronize, and for 11 seconds, I exist in both places at once. Here in the basement and there in the spaces between. My ex-wife called yesterday, said I sounded different, distant. I told her it was just the basement, that old buildings in Boston change you. She laughed, but it was nervous. She could hear something in my voice, probably the echo that's been growing stronger. Soon I won't need the phone at all. My voice will carry through the walls, through the network, another whisper in someone else's recording. I leave this account as a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The basement on Commonwealth Avenue is still for rent. It always is, always will be. The landlord will tell you about the building's personality. She'll warn you about the drafts. You'll laugh it off. And then some night when you can't sleep, you'll notice the time. 3:47 a.m. You'll feel the cold. Count the 11 seconds. Hear your name in the whispers. By then, it will be too late. You'll already be part of the schedule. The handprints on my wall have started to fade, but not because they're disappearing. It's because I'm matching their transparency. Soon, someone new will move in. They'll notice the draft, start documenting, begin their transformation. I'll be watching from the spaces between the walls. We all will. The building has such personality after all. And personalities, like schedules, are meant to be shared. 3:47 a.m. is coming again. I can feel it in the walls, in my bones, what's left of them. Time to synchronize, time to watch, time to whisper your name into the dark. I know your schedule better than you do. I always have. Story 12. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. That's what the old-timer at the gas station told me when I first moved to Phoenix 3 years ago, and I laughed it off as local color. Now, standing in the hallway of a house that shouldn't exist the way it does, I understand he wasn't talking about dehydration or getting lost in the heat. I've photographed hundreds of properties across the Valley of the Sun. Empty houses are my specialty. Staging companies love my work because I can make a vacant home look inviting, full of possibility. But this house off Dynamite Boulevard, where the city bleeds into raw desert, was different from the moment I pulled into the gravel driveway. The listing agent had been vague on the phone. She needed photos by end of week, standard package, nothing special. The property had been sitting empty for 8 months, she said, which wasn't unusual in this market. What was unusual was how she paused before giving me the lockbox code, like she was deciding whether to warn me about something. The house itself was unremarkable. A late 90s build, Santa Fe style with those rounded edges that were popular back then. Earth-toned stucco that blended into the desert landscape. I arrived at golden hour, the best time for exterior shots. The saguaros cast long shadows across the property, and the light painted the mountains purple in the distance. I started with the exterior, working methodically through my checklist. Front elevation, check. Backyard with the view of 4 peaks, check. Pool area. though the water had turned an unsettling green despite the service tag dated last week. Check. Everything normal, everything routine, until I entered through the front door. The air inside was wrong. Not stale exactly, but thick, like it had weight to it. The house had been staged minimally, a few pieces of rental furniture to give buyers a sense of scale. The thermostat read 74 degrees, but I could see my breath for just a moment when I exhaled. Must be the AC, I told myself, though the vents weren't blowing. I set up in the living room first, positioning my tripod to capture the vaulted ceilings and the wall of windows facing the desert. Through my viewfinder, everything looked perfect. Click, move to the kitchen. Click, master bedroom with its mountain views. Click, methodical, professional, normal. The hallway was last. It stretched from the living area to the bedrooms, maybe 20 feet long, with recessed lighting that created pools of brightness against terracotta tiles. I positioned my camera at one end, adjusting for the contrast between light and shadow. That's when I saw it through the viewfinder, a shadow stretching across the floor, elongated like late afternoon sun would create. But the shadow was wrong. It stretched toward the windows, not away from them, toward the light source. I looked up from my camera. The hallway was normal, shadows falling where they should. Back through the viewfinder, the wrong shadow was there again, darker now, with edges that seemed to writhe slightly if I didn't look directly at them. I took the shot anyway. Then another from a different angle, and another. Each time, only through the camera could I see that impossible shadow, growing more defined with each frame. My hands were steady. They had to be in my line of work. But a cold sweat had started between my shoulder blades. I worked through the rest of the house quickly, not looking at the LCD screen to review the photos. I'd check them at home, in my office, where things made sense. The drive back to Scottsdale felt longer than usual. The AC in my truck couldn't quite cut through the heat that clung to my skin, different from desert heat, more like fever. At home, I uploaded the photos immediately, needing to prove to myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But there it was in every hallway shot. That shadow, dark and viscous looking in the digital files, stretching the wrong direction. In one image, I could swear I saw something in the shadow. Not quite a shape, but a suggestion of form, like looking at clouds and seeing faces. I called the listing agent. No answer. Left a message explaining I'd need to reshoot the hallway. Technical issue with the lighting. She texted back almost immediately. Just use what you have. That should have been the end of it. Should have been. But I couldn't let it go. The photos were technically flawed. My reputation depended on perfection, on making empty spaces look inviting. So the next morning, I drove back out to the house, the desert already shimmering with heat at 7 a.m. The lockbox code still worked. I pushed open the front door, and that weighted air hit me again. Thicker this time, almost syrupy in my lungs. I headed straight for the hallway, determined to get the shots and leave. That's when I noticed the doors. Yesterday, I'd left all the interior doors open. It's part of my process, making spaces feel connected and flowing for the photos. But now, 3 doors along the hallway were closed. Not just closed, padlocked. Ancient-looking padlocks, rust bleeding down the white doors in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing. My breath came shorter. I hadn't seen these yesterday. The listing agent hadn't mentioned them. I touched one carefully. The metal was ice cold despite the warming house. And when I pulled my hand back, my fingertips were stained with rust that wouldn't wipe off on my jeans. I called the listing agent again. This time she answered on the first ring. "There are padlocks on the doors," I said without preamble. Silence. Then, "What padlocks?" "Old ones, rusted, on 3 of the bedroom doors." "That's impossible. The owner, he said there were never any locks on the interior doors. Ever." "Well, they're here now." She sighed, a sound that carried more weight than it should have. "Look, just photograph around them, or don't include those rooms. The buyer won't care about every single space. I need to redo the hallway shots. The lighting was... The photos you sent are fine." Her voice was sharp now, almost desperate. "Please, just leave it alone." She hung up. I stood in that hallway, padlocked doors on my right, that wrongness in the air pressing against my skin, and I knew I should leave. Every instinct, every bit of common sense screamed at me to walk out, drive away, forget this house existed. Instead, I found myself walking to the back door, looking out at the pool that was now crystal clear, no trace of yesterday's green. The service tag was gone, and there, on the small mat by the sliding door, a mat I was certain hadn't been there before, was a key. It was brass, old like the padlocks, and when I picked it up, the weight of it was wrong. Too heavy for its size, like it was made of something denser than metal. Engraved on the bow were letters that made my stomach clench. RJM, my initials, Robert James Morrison. My hand shook as I walked back to the hallway. The key was cold, so cold it almost burned, but I couldn't let go of it. It fit perfectly into the first padlock, turning with a click that echoed longer than it should have in the empty house. The door swung open on its own, silent despite the aged hinges I could see. Inside was a bedroom, but not empty like it should have been. My equipment was there, my tripod, my camera, my lights. Set up perfectly in the center of the room, pointed at the far wall. But I was holding my camera. My tripod was in my truck. These were mine, but not mine, familiar but wrong, like looking at your reflection and seeing it blink first. I approached slowly, each step deliberate and careful. The camera on the tripod was my exact model, down to the small scratch on the lens hood from when I dropped it last year. But the LCD screen was on, showing an image I hadn't taken, the hallway, but from an angle that would require standing inside the wall itself. In the image I could see myself, standing exactly where I was now, looking at the camera. But in the photo, I was also behind myself, and behind that version, another, and another, an infinite regression of Roberts, all looking at something just out of frame, all with expressions of dawning realization and growing fear. I jerked back, and the movement knocked the tripod. The camera fell, and when it hit the tile floor, the sound was wrong. Not the crack of breaking equipment, but something wet, organic. The camera dissolved into that same rust that stained the doors, spreading across the floor in patterns that almost formed words. Almost made sense if I could just look at them right. The second padlocked door was already open when I turned around, though I hadn't heard it. Inside, the same scene, my equipment, perfectly arranged. But this time the camera was taking photos on its own. Click, flash, click, flash. Each image appearing on the screen for just a moment, showing rooms in this house I hadn't seen, couldn't exist given the layout. Rooms with too many corners. Rooms where the ceiling was also the floor. Rooms where shadows fell upward and light pooled in impossible places. In one split-second image, I saw myself in one of those impossible rooms, but older, grayer, taking photos of emptiness with desperate intensity. In another, I was younger, just starting out, but my eyes were ancient and hollow. Click, flash. Versions of me, could have beens and never weres, and might still be's. The third door. I didn't want to open the third door, but the key was already in the lock, my hand turning it without my permission. This room was different. No equipment, just a single photograph pinned to the wall, 8 by 10, professional quality. It was the hallway of this house, my hallway shot, but perfected. The composition was flawless, the lighting impossible in its beauty, shadows and light playing in ways that made the empty space look alive, inviting, warm. It was the photo I'd tried to take, wanted to take, needed to take. At the bottom, a small watermark. RJM photography, final image, do not step here. I looked down. My feet were exactly where they would need to be to take this photo, standing in the spot marked by a small X someone had scratched into the tile. No, not scratched, photographed. The X was made of tiny photographs, hundreds of them, each showing this same spot from minutely different angles, creating a mosaic that spelled out a warning I was already violating. The air grew thicker, pressing against me from all sides. Through the viewfinder of the camera that was somehow in my hands now, when had I picked it up, I could see the hallway transforming. Not dramatically, but subtly. The walls breathing slightly. The tiles shifting like a sliding puzzle, working itself toward some final configuration. The shadows. God, the shadows. Reaching toward me with purpose now. Not random plays of light, but deliberate, hungry things. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move from the X. The camera lifted to my eye without my control, and I saw through it what I was meant to photograph. Myself, standing in this exact spot, camera to my eye, trapped in the act of taking the photo that would trap me in the act of taking the photo that would trap me in the act of taking the photo. The recursion made my head spin, vertigo pulling me in all directions at once. I was the photographer and the subject, the observer and the observed, the hunter and the hunted. The house had been waiting for me, specifically me. Had been empty, not because no one wanted it, but because it wanted someone specific. A photographer, someone who understood composition and light, someone who could appreciate the perfect shot, someone who wouldn't be able to resist taking it. My finger moved toward the shutter button. Every instinct screamed to stop, but the composition was perfect now. The light was impossible and beautiful. The shadows were wrong in exactly the right way. This would be my masterpiece, the photo that defined my career, that would make every sacrificed weekend and missed opportunity worth it. Just one shot, just one perfect capture of this perfect moment. But I knew, somehow, I knew, that pressing that button would lock me into place like the others. The others? Yes. I could see them now, through the viewfinder. Other photographers, dozens of them, standing in the same spot across different times, all taking the same photo, all trapped in that perfect moment of almost creation. We were the shadows falling the wrong way, our presence bending light and logic, creating the very wrongness that drew us here. My finger hovering over the button, sweat running down my face despite the cold that was seeping into my bones. I fought against the compulsion. This wasn't my shot to take. This was the house's shot, using me as its camera, adding my perspective to its collection of frozen moments. With effort that felt like tearing part of myself away, I lowered the camera. The house groaned around me, disappointed, angry. The padlocks rattled on the doors that were somehow closed again. The shadows writhed and reached, but without looking through the viewfinder, they were just shadows. I ran, out of the hallway, through the living room where the furniture was now arranged differently, or had it always been that way, out the front door into the blazing desert sun that felt like salvation. My truck was there, real and solid and mine. I drove without looking back, without checking mirrors, afraid I'd see the house following somehow, stretching its hallway behind me like a shadow falling the wrong direction. Only when I reached the city limits did I pull over, hands shaking too badly to drive safely. The camera was still around my neck, my camera, not the house's, though I couldn't remember grabbing it. I checked the memory card with trembling fingers. Empty. No photos from today. But there was one image I didn't remember taking, a single shot of my home office taken from outside the window. In the reflection on the glass, barely visible, was the hallway of that house, superimposed over my familiar space. I've deleted the image a dozen times. It keeps coming back. Sometimes it's in different folders, sometimes with different timestamps, but always the same. My office, the window, and that hallway waiting in the reflection. The listing agent won't return my calls. The property isn't on the MLS anymore. When I drive out Dynamite Boulevard, I can't find the turnoff. But sometimes, in houses I'm photographing, I see it. A shadow falling the wrong way, just for a moment, just through the viewfinder. And I know it's still waiting. The perfect shot is still there. Composition ideal, lighting impossible, shadows hungry. The X is still marked on the floor, waiting for feet to stand in exactly the right spot. The house is patient. It knows about photographers. It knows we can't resist the perfect shot forever. Lately, I've been dreaming about that hallway. In the dreams, I'm standing on the X, camera raised, finger on the button. But I'm also watching myself from outside, and watching the watcher, and watching the watcher's watcher. An infinite recursion of observation that makes me wake gasping and disoriented, unsure which version of me opened his eyes. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. The old-timer was right about that. But some mistakes aren't mistakes at all. They're invitations, carefully composed and perfectly lit, waiting for someone who understands the importance of being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. I know I'll go back. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday when the light is perfect and the shadows are falling just wrong enough to be right. I'll stand on that X, raise my camera, and take the shot that's already been taken, will be taken, is being taken right now in some timeline where I never lowered the camera at all. The house is patient. It has my initials on a key and my future in a photograph. And somewhere, in a hallway that exists in the space between light and shadow, the perfect shot is waiting. Story 13. The warehouse breathes differently at 3 in the morning. I discovered this during my second week as night watchman at the old Graymont facility in Brooklyn. Not the mechanical wheeze of ventilation systems or the settling sighs of corrugated metal cooling after sunset. Something else entirely. A rhythm that doesn't match anything human or machine. Like the building itself is drawing air through corridors that shouldn't exist. My phone shows 2:47 a.m. when I clock in through the app, but the system logs me at 2:27. 20 minutes that vanish between the parking lot and the security desk. 20 minutes where that distant metallic scraping fills my ears like tinnitus, before suddenly cutting out. I've tried everything. Arriving earlier, later, recording myself walking from car to door. The videos show nothing unusual. Just me walking normally for 3 minutes. Yet somehow I always lose those 20 minutes. And the app always knows. The Graymont warehouse squats between a demolished textile factory and a plot of cracked concrete where they're supposed to build condos that never materialize. 6 stories of brick and steel beam construction, built in 1952 according to the faded cornerstone, though the shipping labels I find scattered around suggest otherwise. Last Tuesday, I discovered a crate tagged with receiving dates from 1947, the wood fresh as if cut yesterday. Moisture beating on its surface despite the industrial dehumidifiers running constantly. The owners, some investment group whose checks clear but whose representatives I've never met, pay me to walk the floors, check the locks, and log anything unusual. The irony isn't lost on me that everything here qualifies as unusual, but I need the money, and working nights means avoiding the cramped apartment I share with 2 strangers who work days. Tonight, the metallic sound starts earlier. Usually it begins somewhere around the 4th floor, a rhythmic scraping like someone dragging a crowbar across steel grating. By the time I reach the source, or where I think the source should be, it's moved. Always 1 floor up or down, always just out of sight. But tonight it's here on the ground level, close enough that I can feel it in my teeth. I follow protocol, sweeping my flashlight across the aisles of pallets. Everything appears normal. Rows of shrink-wrapped boxes labeled with company names I don't recognize. Some in languages that look almost like English, but with letters that hurt to focus on. The beam catches something. Fresh forklift tracks in the dust, even though the only forklift has been broken for 3 weeks. Its battery pulled and sitting on a workbench in the maintenance room. The tracks lead deeper into the warehouse, past the newer inventory to the older sections where fluorescent tubes flicker, or don't work at all. Here, the pallets are wood instead of plastic, held together with square head nails that nobody's used since the 50s. The boxes bear shipping stamps from companies I later Google and find went bankrupt decades ago. Yet the cardboard corners are sharp, uncreased by time. My flashlight dims. New batteries, I put them in myself an hour ago, and in that diminished circle of light, I see my employee ID badge hanging from a beam 20 feet overhead. Not my current one, which is clipped to my belt, but the backup they issued me last week, the one I keep in my car's glove compartment. Except when I check my pocket, I find the car keys but remember clearly. I haven't been to my car since arriving, haven't I? The badge sways slightly despite no air movement. Below it, a puddle of water reflects its laminated surface. Though when I look up, the ceiling is bone dry. The persistent leak that's supposedly been dripping there for months, the one mentioned in the handover notes from the previous guard, shows no sign of moisture. The concrete above is pristine, not even a water stain. I reach for my phone to photograph this, to prove to myself later that I'm not losing it, but the screen shows 2:27 a.m., Still 2:27, though I know I've been here at least an hour. The clock app, the phone system time, even the timestamp on my last photo, all frozen at 2:27. The metallic dragging intensifies, now coming from directly above. Not the second floor, the ceiling itself, as if something is being pulled through the space between floors, through areas that shouldn't have enough clearance for anything larger than wiring and insulation. Dust drifts down, and in it, I smell something wrong. Ocean salt and rust, though we're miles from the harbor. I climb the stairs to the second floor, each step echoing wrong. The sound arriving before my foot hits the metal. The door at the top is already open. I locked it myself during my first round. I always lock it. It's muscle memory by now. Through the doorway, the floor stretches longer than it should. The building is 300 feet deep. I've walked it enough times to know, but the flashlight beam doesn't reach the far wall. Halfway down the impossibly long aisle, a figure stands beside a pallet. My height, my build, wearing the same uniform. It's checking items on a clipboard, and when it turns its head slightly, I see my own profile. But the clothes are different. Older in style, though new in condition. The security company logo, one I don't recognize. I call out, and my voice comes back wrong. Not an echo, but an overlap, like two recordings played slightly out of sync. The figure doesn't respond, just continues checking boxes, making marks on its clipboard. I move closer, and the distance doesn't decrease. If anything, it stretches, the figure always the same 50 feet away no matter how many steps I take. Then I hear it, my own voice, coming from the figure, counting under its breath. But the numbers are wrong. 47, 48, 49, 1950, 51. Years, not quantities. It's counting years. The air pressure changes, that feeling before a storm when your ears need to pop. The fluorescent tubes that were dead suddenly blaze to life. All of them, even the ones I know were removed for disposal. In that harsh light, I see them. Dozens of figures, all me or almost me, each checking different palettes, different clipboards, each from different times. One wears a uniform from a company that went under in the 80s. Another has a clipboard that's actually a tablet. Technology that looks wrong. Too advanced. The logo, a company that doesn't exist yet. They all stop. Turn. Look at me with my own eyes, each set reflecting a different kind of exhaustion, a different weight of knowledge. The closest one, the one counting years, mouths something. A warning? An explanation? I can't tell because my vision is starting to blur, that 20-minute gap opening up around me like water circling a drain. I back toward the stairs, but the door is gone. Not closed, gone. Smooth wall where it should be, painted in a color the warehouse has never been. The figures start moving again, returning to their work. But now I notice they're not just checking inventory. They're changing it. Moving boxes from one pallet to another, each movement shifting something fundamental about the space. One of them, wearing a uniform so new the creases are still sharp, places a box on a shelf. The label reads tomorrow's date. Another, in a uniform threadbare with age, removes the same box, now covered in dust, its label faded to illegibility. They're organizing time itself, treating past and future like inventory to be shuffled, stored, retrieved. The metallic dragging sound returns, louder now, and I realize it's not dragging at all. It's the sound of time being pulled across itself, moments scraping against moments like tectonic plates. The warehouse isn't just old, it's every age it's ever been and will be, all at once. And I, am the only constant, hired over and over to watch, to witness, to be part of the mechanism that keeps it running. My phone buzzes. A text from an unknown number. Check northwest corner, ground floor. Urgent. The timestamp is from 3 days in the future. I run, past the figures of myself, past pallets of impossibilities, downstairs that sometimes have 17 steps and sometimes have 23. The ground floor is different now. Older, newer, both. The northwest corner has a door I've never seen before. Metal painted the green of hospital walls from the 70s. Inside, filing cabinets, dozens of them, each drawer labeled with a year. I pull one open, 1987. Inside, time cards, all filled out in my handwriting, though I was 5 years old in 1987. Another drawer, 2031, the same. My signature on incident reports describing events I don't remember but somehow know are true. The bottom drawer of the last cabinet has no year, just a symbol that makes my eyes water. Inside, a single folder. The employment contract, dating back to when the warehouse was built, forward to dates that haven't happened. My signature on every page, each one looking slightly more tired than the last. The final page is different. A note, my handwriting but older, shakier. The 20 minutes aren't lost. They're when you're actually working. The rest is just you waiting for your shift to begin again. Behind me, footsteps. I turn to see myself, older, grayer, wearing a uniform from a security company I don't recognize. This version of me looks tired beyond description, shoulders bent with the weight of decades or centuries. First time you found the room? The older me asks, voice rough with disuse. I nod, unable to speak. Gets easier. He lies. And I know it's a lie because I can feel the weight of all those future shifts pressing down on me already. You'll learn to stop counting eventually. Stop trying to figure out which timeline you're in. They're all real. We're all real. How do I get out? He almost smiles. You already did. You already will. You never do. He checks his watch. Analog. The kind nobody makes anymore. Your shift's almost over. The you that's been working the normal shift anyway. That you gets to leave. Go home. Sleep. This you. We've got inventory to check. The fluorescent tubes flicker and die. In the darkness, I hear dozens of footsteps, all walking the same route, all checking the same locks, all losing the same 20 minutes that aren't lost at all, but are the only real minutes in this place where time is just another product to be stored and shipped. My phone shows 6:47 a.m. Shift ends at 7 a.m. 13 minutes left, except I know now that minutes don't mean what I thought they meant. In 13 minutes, another me will clock out, drive home, sleep. And another me will clock in for the first time, thinking this is just a normal warehouse job. But this me, the one who found the filing room, the one who saw the other versions, this me is already walking back to the aisles, clipboard in hand, checking boxes that won't exist for 30 years, that ceased to exist 40 years ago. The warehouse breathes around me, in and out, a rhythm that matches neither human nor machine but something in between, something outside of normal time, and I breathe with it, because I always have, because I always will, because I am already here tomorrow and was here yesterday, and the 20 minutes aren't lost. They're when I'm actually real. I clock out at 7 a.m., and I clock in at 2:27, and both are true, and neither is true, and the metallic sound isn't dragging anymore. It's just the sound of all of us, all of me, walking the rounds, checking the inventory of time itself, making sure nothing is lost even when everything is. When I get to my car, will get to my car, have already gotten to my car, the backup ID badge is in the glove compartment where it should be, and also hanging from that beam, dry despite the leak that exists and doesn't exist. I drive home through Brooklyn streets that are sometimes cobblestone and sometimes fresh asphalt, past buildings that are there and not there, and I know that tonight, every tonight, I'll clock in again at 2:47, lose 20 minutes, and find them waiting for me in a warehouse that breathes with the lungs of every moment it has ever been. The check clears. It always clears. The amount is different each time, but also always the same. Enough to keep me coming back, not enough to ever leave. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet in a room that doesn't exist, another version of me is writing this down, has already written it down, will write it down, creating the report that I'll find in 3 weeks when I open the wrong door, the right door, the only door that matters. The warehouse needs a night watchman. It always has. It always will. And I am already there. Story 14. The neon sign outside my window stuttered like a dying heartbeat. 3 long pulses. 2 short. Then a pause that stretched just long enough to make me count the seconds. I'd been watching it for the past hour, sitting on the edge of the bed in this roadside motel somewhere between Albuquerque and nowhere, trying to convince myself the pattern meant nothing. But patterns don't lie. They reveal themselves to those who pay attention, and I'd always been cursed with the inability to look away from things that didn't quite fit. The Desert Rose Motor Lodge squatted beside Highway 285, like a sun-bleached corpse, its pink stucco walls crumbling at the edges. I'd pulled in around midnight, eyes burning from 14 hours of driving, needing nothing more than a bed and a few hours of unconsciousness before continuing west. The night clerk, a woman whose face seemed to shift in the fluorescent lighting, never quite settling into focus, had handed me the key to room 12 without asking for identification. She'd just looked at me with eyes that reflected too much light and said I was expected. I should have left then. Should have gotten back in my car and driven until I found another place, any other place. But exhaustion makes fools of us all, and the weight of the day pressed down on my shoulders like hands trying to force me to my knees. The room smelled of old cigarettes and something else, something organic and sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. The bedspread, a nauseating pattern of orange and brown geometric shapes, seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at it. I'd thrown my bag on the chair and collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to remove my shoes. That's when I first noticed the neon sign's rhythm. 3 long, 2 short, pause. 3 long, 2 short, pause. My fingers found the notepad on the nightstand, cheap paper with the motel's logo bleeding through from the cover. Someone had been here before me, leaving behind pages of meticulous notes. Times, all of them. Lists of times written in different hands, different inks, but all following the same format. 4:12 a.m., 8:24 a.m., 12:36 p.m., 4:48 p.m., 9 p.m., 1:12 a.m. The pattern continued for pages. Every 12 minutes past the hour, every 24, every 36. Multiples of 12, climbing and resetting. My engineering background kicked in automatically, looking for the logic, the formula. But what disturbed me more than the times themselves was realizing that the neon sign's pattern, 3 long, 2 short, matched the intervals between them when converted to minutes. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtain across to block out the sign's insistent Morse code. The room plunged into darkness, save for the thin strip of light beneath the door. I fumbled for the lamp switch. The ceiling fan began to turn. I hadn't touched the fan's pull chain. The switch on the wall remained in the off position, but the blades rotated with deliberate slowness, and as they picked up speed, they created a rhythm. A whoosh, 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 whoosh. Pause. 3 long, 2 short. My hand found the wall switch and flipped it. The fan continued its pattern, unchanged. I flipped it again. Nothing. The fan spun on, marking time in a code I was beginning to understand but desperately didn't want to. The mini fridge in the corner kicked on with a mechanical hum. Its compressor cycled. 3 long hums, 2 short clicks, then silence before repeating. The bathroom faucet began to drip, each drop hitting the porcelain with perfect timing. 3 slow drops, 2 quick ones. Pause. Everything in the room had synchronized into a single message, repeated endlessly in every possible medium. The very air seemed to pulse with it, pressing against my eardrums in waves. I grabbed the notepad, comparing the times to my watch. 1:12 a.m., right on schedule. My hand shook as I tried to decode what felt like the world's most obvious cipher. 3 long, 2 short. If this was Morse code, it would be O, followed by I. O-I. But that meant nothing. Unless I counted the intervals differently. 3-2, 32, or 3-2. A ratio. My mind raced through possibilities while the room continued its relentless communication. Then I saw the new line someone had added to the bottom of the list, written in fresh ink that hadn't quite dried. Don't accept the exchange. The words hit me like cold water. I dropped the notepad, and as it hit the floor, the pages fanned out, revealing more messages hidden between the times. Different handwriting, different inks, but all variations of the same warning. Don't accept the exchange. The exchange is not what they promise. They lie about the exchange. Refuse the exchange. The room's symphony stopped. Silence crashed over me like a wave, so sudden and complete that my ears rang with its absence. The fan slowed to a stop. The fridge went quiet. Even the drip from the faucet ceased. I stood in the perfect stillness, notepad at my feet, waiting for something I couldn't name. At 4:12 a.m. exactly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They moved with mechanical precision, each footfall exactly the same distance apart, the same pressure, the same duration. They stopped directly outside my door. No shadow appeared in the strip of light beneath it. The footsteps had simply terminated at my threshold, as if whoever made them had ceased to exist upon arrival. A soft, sliding sound, barely audible. Something being pushed under the door. I approached slowly, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. A white business card lay on the floor, face down. When I picked it up and turned it over, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The name printed on it was mine, but not the name I'd used to check in, not the name I'd used for the past 5 years. This was my old name, the one I'd legally changed after the incident in Portland, the one no one should know anymore. Beneath it, a single word in the same formal typeface. Confirm? I wanted to tear the card to pieces, to pretend I'd never seen it, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate. They held the card steady as I read my abandoned name over and over, each repetition making it feel more real, more present, as if by acknowledging it, I was somehow accepting its return. The patterns started again. This time, they came from outside the room. Car alarms in the parking lot triggered in sequence. The ice machine down the hall, dispensing cubes in rhythm. Even the wind picked up, whistling through unseen gaps in perfect time. 3 long, 2 short. But now I understood. It wasn't a code at all. It was a countdown. 3-2, 3-2. Each repetition slightly faster than the last, like a heart rate climbing toward panic. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone. But the screen showed no signal, no carrier, just the time, 4:24 a.m., and a single notification I didn't remember receiving. Exchange pending. Confirm to proceed. Below it, 2 options, accept or decline. My thumb hovered over decline, but something made me hesitate. What exactly was I declining? What exchange? The room seemed to lean in around me, waiting for my decision. The patterns grew faster, more insistent. 3-2, 3-2, 3-2, 3-2. I thought about my old name on the card, about the life I'd abandoned in Portland, about the person I'd been versus the person I'd become. What if this wasn't about taking something from me? What if it was about giving something back, or replacing something that had been replaced? The thought crawled into my mind unbidden. What if I wasn't the first version of myself to stand in this room? What if the person who'd changed his name 5 years ago, who'd fled Portland and rebuilt his life, wasn't the original, but the replacement, and now the original wanted back in? I looked at my reflection in the black screen of the television. For just a moment, I swear, I saw movement that wasn't mine, a slight tilt of the head, a narrowing of eyes that I hadn't commanded. The reflection smiled, and I felt my face remain perfectly still. The patterns reached a crescendo. Everything in the room vibrated with them. The walls, the floor, the air itself. The message had evolved from, "Don't accept the exchange," to something more primal, more desperate. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was begging. I thought about the notepad, about all those different hands writing the same warning. How many people had stood where I stood, holding a card with their forgotten name, facing this same decision? How many had chosen accept? How many had chosen decline? And more importantly, which choice left them free to write the warning? My phone buzzed. The notification had changed. Exchange timeout in 10, 9, 8. I had to choose, accept the exchange and become, what? My old self? Or someone else's old self? Decline and remain who I was. But was that even me anymore? The reflection in the TV screen moved again, mouthing words I couldn't hear. Its lips shaped a single phrase over and over. I want back in. 765. The pattern stopped again. This time the silence felt expectant, like the inhale before a scream. Every surface in the room reflected a slightly different version of my face, each one wearing an expression I didn't recognize. Some looked terrified, others eager. One was laughing silently, tears streaming down its cheeks. 4, 3, 2. I made my choice. The instant my thumb hit the screen, the room exploded with sound. Not the patterns this time, but voices. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all speaking in unison with perfect clarity. Exchange confirmed. But I hadn't pressed accept, I'd pressed decline. The phone showed my choice clearly. Decline selected in red letters. But the voices continued their announcement. And I realized with mounting horror that the choice had been an illusion. There had only ever been one option, dressed up to look like two. The exchange was happening regardless of what I wanted. The business card in my hand began to warm, then burn. I tried to drop it, but it clung to my palm like it was part of my skin. The name on it, my old name, began to glow, the letters crawling off the card and up my arm like living things. I could feel them burrowing under my skin, rewriting something fundamental in my DNA, in my very conception of self. The reflection in the TV stepped forward, pressing its palms against the inside of the screen. Its mouth moved, and this time I could hear it, speaking in a voice that was mine but wasn't. Finally. I ran for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. Not locked. Something worse. It simply didn't recognize my touch anymore, as if my fingerprints had changed, as if I'd become a stranger to the physical world I'd inhabited moments before. The room itself was rejecting me, or accepting someone else. The notepad lay open on the floor, and I saw with perfect, terrible clarity that all the different handwriting was actually the same, just written by different versions of the same person, each one trying to warn the next iteration about an exchange that had already happened, would always happen, was happening right now. I grabbed the pen from the nightstand and added my own warning to the list, my hand moving almost involuntarily. Don't accept the exchange. But even as I wrote, I knew it was pointless. The next me, or the previous me, or whatever version would stand here next, would write the same thing, thinking they were the first. The patterns returned one final time, but now they came from inside my own body. My heartbeat, 3 long, 2 short. My breathing, 3 long, 2 short. Even my thoughts seemed to pulse in that rhythm, as if the message had been encoded in my cells all along, waiting for this moment to activate. 4:36 a.m., right on schedule. The ceiling fan began to turn backward. I watched my reflection in the darkened TV screen stand up and walk away, disappearing into whatever space existed behind the glass. At the same moment, I felt myself moving without volition, my body walking toward the screen, toward the reflection that was no longer there. Or maybe I was the reflection, and the real me had just left. The business card in my hand now showed a different name. Not my old one, not my current one, but something else entirely. A name I didn't recognize but somehow knew was mine, had always been mine, would always be mine. The exchange wasn't replacing me with someone else. It was replacing me with all the someone else's I could have been, should have been, would be. The room's surfaces stopped reflecting my face and started reflecting other rooms. The same room, but different. Room 12 in 1,000 different Desert Rose motor lodges, each one identical except for the person standing in the middle, holding a business card, realizing too late that the warning wasn't about preventing the exchange. It was about recognizing when it had already happened. I picked up the notepad again, flipping to a fresh page. My hand moved on its own, writing times in neat columns. 5:48 a.m., 10 a.m., 2:12 p.m., 6:24 p.m., 10:36 p.m., 2:48 a.m. The pattern would continue. Someone else would find it, another me, or someone who used to be me, or someone I would become. They would stand here at 1:12 a.m., watching the neon sign pulse its message. thinking they were the first to notice the pattern. 3 long, 2 short. Pause. The exchange never stops. It just waits for the next confirmation, the next person to think they have a choice. We all check into room 12 eventually. We all find the notepad. We all receive the card with our forgotten name. And we all press decline, thinking it makes a difference. The neon sign outside stutters one last time and goes dark. In the silence that follows, I hear footsteps in the hallway. Measured, mechanical, precise. They stop outside the door. I know what comes next because I've done it before. We'll do it again. I'm doing it right now in another room 12, sliding a business card under another door, to another version of myself who hasn't realized yet that the exchange already happened the moment they saw the pattern, the moment they recognized it as a pattern at all. Because patterns don't lie. They reveal themselves to those who pay attention. And I've always been cursed with the inability to look away from things that didn't quite fit. Even when the thing that didn't quite fit was me.